I was staying with my brother at a cabin in northern Montana. It was in a dip between the mountains, tucked away in the trees. Both me and my brother Johnny were very outdoorsy, so this was a pretty typical trip for us, hanging out in the woods, going for hikes, and just exploring. Because of the drive, we spent the first day taking it slow, hanging around the cabin and enjoying the scenery without doing too much away from the cabin. I think it was around 5:30 when Johnny decided to go for a walk before it got dark. I didn't pay much attention and just looked over at him as he walked out and said, "All right." He didn't bring any backpack or anything, so I knew he was just going for something short. I laid back down and chilled on the couch near the fireplace. I was barely awake, exhausted from doing most of the driving earlier. But the cabin slowly got darker and darker as the sun fell behind the mountains. Only once it was just the fireplace lighting up the cabin did I realize Johnny hadn't come back yet. And obviously it was way too dark to be walking around still without any gear. I jumped up and grabbed my day bag along with a headlamp and a flashlight, then headed out to make sure he was okay. My first thought was that we were in bear country, so I was pretty nervous about Johnny possibly running into one, although, as I got deeper into the woods along the path, my nervousness shifted toward a different possibility. I kept getting a bad sense, making me look behind myself several times, as if expecting someone to be there. Never saw anything, though. In just 10 minutes down the trail, I saw Johnny coming down toward me. He looked uneasy, and he wasn't in a dead sprint or anything. Bud was moving fairly quickly, like he was trying to get away from something. We both started talking at the same time. I was trying to ask what was going on, and he was trying to tell me to turn back and get to the cabin. Eventually, we both just started fast walking back, getting back inside, where he then told me he saw someone watching him from out in the trees. He said the guy looked really creepy, and as he kept walking through the trail, the man almost seemed to be stalking him. Johnny thought if he just walked back to the cabin in the daylight, the guy might have followed him. So he waited till dark. Johnny, probably because he was the older brother, assured me it was likely nothing, though, and he was just trying to be safe rather than sorry. I trusted him and tried not to worry about it. The guy he saw probably just had a cabin nearby, too, or was on a hike. We made dinner, then sat out on the front porch for the rest of the night next to a campfire. I think both of us were also trying to keep watch for anyone watching us, but neither of yous admitted it. The mountains got more quiet as the night went on. We talked around the campfire well into the night, going in later and sleeping until morning. After a short breakfast, we packed our bags and left to go on the main hike in the area, going up to the peak of one of the mountains and taking around 6 hours. Both of us were super exhausted afterward. The last hour of walking back to the cabin felt like it dragged on. Heading in, Johnny tossed his bag down and said he was going to take a shower. I waited on the couch. The cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom, so I had to wait for him. I was only laying there for a minute, though, when I randomly just remembered about the guy my brother was talking about yesterday. I got up and looked out the windows, almost expecting to see him out there. I went back over to the couch, but I just felt strange all of a sudden. A few more minutes went by trying to figure out what it was I was feeling, when I noticed the obnoxious sound of the water pump for the shower hadn't started yet. Johnny, and a response. I got up and walked down the hall toward the bedroom. I knocked on the door and said his name again. I felt something unsettling as I reached down and cracked open the door. I opened it slowly, maybe just a few inches, and could see Johnny between the crack and the door. He was kneeling down in the corner of the room, eyes wide open and staring at me, subtly shaking his head no, clearly telling me to go away. The fear in his eyes was sound-nerving. It still is burned into my memory, clear as day. Just a horrifying sight I wish I never have to see again. I pushed the door open fully, seeing Amon standing just a few feet from him. He also had wide eyes, but in a tired, disturbing way. He wore disheveled, torn-up clothes and had oily, long black hair. In that moment, I didn't have to think. It was just my instant, unprocessed reaction to stop him. It charged at him, and only once I was a couple steps away, I saw him raise a gun from his side. I tackled him, and Johnny immediately knew what to do. We wrestled the gun away from him and got him mostly under control. I swear this guy was feral, screaming and screeching and clawing to try to get away. I had never seen anything like it. He wasn't letting up either. So, it took a while to figure out exactly how to get out of this. We decided Johnny, who was much bigger than I was, would hold him down while I got the car ready. I did, Ash said, quickly, tossing our bags in the car, which had everything already packed in it from our recent hike. Then, I turned the car on and got it ready. I went back in and we tried to tie him up with anything we could find around the cabin, just enough to let us get away. And obviously, we took the gun with us. We could hear him screaming from inside the cabin as we drove away. Once we were in service, we notified police, but by the time they made it to the cabin, all the scraps we tied him up with were left amidst the floor, and the man was nowhere to be found. My brother said when he went into the room to shower, he was caught completely off guard and held at gunpoint, where he was told to call me into the room. My brother refused, knowing he'd be giving no chance if he did, but then he walked in anyway. We still talk about how insane it was that I tackled the guy. Honestly, I can't even explain it, but it could have been what got us out of that cabin alive. Now, the only clue the authorities have as to who the guy was is from the gun that we gave them. They were able to figure out who it was registered to and found it belonged to a man who'd been missing 5 years from somewhere about 50 miles away from where we were. However, from the description we gave them of what the guy looked like that attacked us, it seemed like it was probably someone else, which leads us to believe that whoever attacked us had also attacked the owner of the firearm, ultimately leaving him as a missing person. So, assuming things had gone any differently, that could have been mine and Johnny's fate as well. This was a while ago, 2014, when I was taking a gap year from college to travel the US out of my car. When I got to the East Coast, my cousin offered me to stay at his cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I took the offer knowing it'd be nice to have an actual place to stay and take a break for a few days. The cabin was nice too. Honestly, it felt a lot more like a vacation home. Definitely a more modern cabin than the tiny log cabins you usually find in the middle of the forest. That I was honestly sort of surprised after seeing it that my cousin let me stay there for free. I started moving a bunch of stuff from my car into the cabin before I went back out to grab whatever was left over and noticed someone watching me. They were out in that tree, standing far from the path and with nothing else but me in the house in his view. He had to be looking at me. Maybe they weren't trying to be creepy though, and I didn't know the area. For all I knew, there could have been cabins and houses all around here, just past the trees and out of sight. That I grabbed the rest and locked my car, bringing it inside, and saw the man still out there facing the cabin as I closed the door. I sent a text to my cousin letting him know I got in okay and was all good, but also that someone was out there watching me. I just asked it if he knew who it might have been. He texted me back while I was unpacking, but I forgot to check it until nearly an hour later, well past when the sun had set. My cousin said the cabin was on 40 acres of his property with a fence around the whole area. Nobody else should have been out there. That immediately made me feel way worse about what I saw. I mean, before I didn't care all that much, but now it was pretty strange that they were on the property just staring at me from afar. I went and looked outside again, but beyond the lights from the cabin, it was pitch black. I couldn't even see up to that tree. It was just complete darkness all around. It gave me a chill as I closed the curtains. That I tried to cool off by watching a movie and resting in the bedroom. The movie helped keep my mind occupied, but it didn't relieve the sense completely. And just about an hour into it, I saw something in the corner of my eye. I looked, locking my eyes on the window where there was a gap in the curtains. It thought I might have just seen something move over there, but now all I could see was my blurry reflection on the glass and only darkness behind it. I quickly got up and started walking toward it when there was suddenly footsteps sprinting through the grass. By the time I was looking out the window, I couldn't see anything and could only faintly hear the footsteps going further into the dark. Immediately called my cousin. I don't know why I didn't just go straight to calling the cops, but my cousin told me to, so I hung up and had the cops on the way within a minute. For how far out the cabin was, the officer made it there in a decent amount of time. However, the guy who had been watching me was long gone, and we both realized pretty quick that there wasn't all that much he could do about it. He couldn't go searching the woods or really do anything at all unless the guy showed up again and hung around long enough for the officer to come back. So I was left alone again. I really couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had for the entire rest of that night. I could have left, but honestly, the thought of bringing all my stuff out to the car, going back and forth from the cabin in the middle of the dark, was more unsettling than just hunkering down inside. Of course, I couldn't help but look out the windows over and over, even though I couldn't see anything at all, for the last hour before bed. It must have been 12 or 1 a.m. and I was just pacing the house, double-checking everything and trying to feel safer about going to sleep. I think I was just pushing it off as much as I could, but it was inevitable. I had to rest. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, headed to the bedroom and locked myself in. I hoped the worst was behind me and got in bed, falling asleep 30 minutes later. I woke up early, like very early, way too early for it to be right. The sun wasn't even up yet, so it had to be around 4 a.m., which meant I'd only slept for a few hours. Almost immediately, my mind went back into that panic state, feeling the need to do a check around the cabin again. There would be no way I could go back to sleep without walking around first to make sure I was still okay. I got up and turned on the hallway light, then just listened for a second. I didn't hear anything but the heavy wind hitting the thin windows throughout the cabin. I started walking but only got halfway down before hearing something else. It sounded like a couple thumps on the end of the cabin. I knew there was a small library kind of room and a kitchen on that end. I crept a bit closer, and through the lights from the hallway, I could see the shadow of something moving near the end. I froze up, wanting to not believe the situation I was in, but the shadow suddenly stopped moving. There was a few seconds. Then it slowly started moving again before a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Just from the shape of the figure, I knew it was the same guy that had been watching, the one I saw out in the trees. It turned around and locked myself back in the bedroom. The silence that followed was deafening. I thought he'd chase me or try to attack me or even break down the door, but it was just silent. I could hear my heart pounding. Then a few slow footsteps moved down the hall right up to the other side of the door, and the man just stood out there. I clenched my phone in my hand, wanting to call for help, but thinking he might hear me and decide to speed up the process of whatever he had planned. So instead, I made the sporadic decision to grab my keys, open the window, and make a run for my car. I got in and sped away from the cabin. When it was all said and done, cops got there and found nobody. The man had entered from a window on the far end that had a broken lock. Whether had broken it or it already was undetermined, but the cops also found the bedroom door open. The lock on it was just one off those standard push-pin ones. Regardless, that meant the man was prepared to open the door and was going to at any minute. So, if I tried to stay there and wait for police, I wouldn't have gotten out so easily. What's really weird is he was there from the moment I arrived at the cabin, which likely means he'd been watching the place for a while, maybe waiting for me or someone to arrive. What he really was intending, I luckily didn't have to find out. Music. In 2016, I made a trip down to my father's old cabin. It was 6 hours away in the woods outside of the hometown he grew up in, which was no longer even a town, just an abandoned row of old buildings and stores along a deserted road. We'd never really go to his cabin because he said there wasn't much of area sun to once the town was gone. But after he passed away, I figured it'd be nice to take a trip down there to visit the home he once built. I knew it'd be in real bad shape, and I wanted to do some restorations on it as best I could, just to keep it standing and preserve it for as long as possible, if anything. I hoped the trip would clear my mind a little and give me some peace and quiet. That I drove there, arriving at the town and parking my car behind one of the abandoned gas station buildings, then walked on the thin, rugged, Winding trail 2M up to the cabin. I had all my backpacking gear and brought along the tools I need for the job. There was a part of me that knew it might have toppled already, so I was prepared to camp the night in a tent if I had to. Luckily, after making the long trek through the woods, though, I found the cabin still standing. It was an asmal clearing in the trees, just a basic rectangular log cabin with vines and greenery growing up the outer walls. When I walked in, I noticed there were no locks on the door and found the interior to be in pretty awful shape. Trash scattered everywhere and a musty, unpleasant smell filling the room. It was clear that at some point someone realized this place wasn't in use and probably had stayed here, maybe for a while, although it seemed it wasn't recent. No signs of anything being there for a couple years or so. That I moved what I could into the corner of the room, making a flat space to put my stuff. And with the sun already setting, I unrolled my sleeping bag and just settled in. I should mention, although I didn't hear or see anything that night, I couldn't sleep for any longer than 30 minutes at a time before waking up with a strange, disturbing feeling. It made for a really bad night that I got up at sunrise, groggy and wondering if this whole trip was a mistake. I used my little camping Stavito, brew up a coffee, then took a walk through the woods to clear my head. It was still kind of dark, the sun only barely peeking out through the trees. A little ways in, I found an overlook, sort of a hill where I could see above the tree line. Thought it'd be a great place to watch the sunrise. But I found something else. I could see the abandoned town from up there. It was very far away, but there was a light. Looked like it was from a window in one of the buildings. I couldn't tell from that distance if it was from a house or a store. And it turned off suddenly a minute later. It made me worry a bit about my car. But mostly I was just surprised anyone else was around here. Likely it was just some urban explorers checking out the town and nothing to worry about. Although it was a really big coincidence. I sat on the hill for an hour watching the sun come up, then walked back through the woods to start working on the cabin. First thing was to reseal and clean up the outside. I will say though, the whole time I was out there working, I kept getting that feeling, the one I had during the night. Every time I looked back at the woods, this eerie sense loomed over me. Took me a bit to really understand what it was that I felt, but eventually I managed to grasp what I think it was. I felt like it wasn't alone. That I kept working, but constantly looked over my shoulder. The possibility of anyone else being out here was genuinely impossible. The abandoned town, sure, but here, some random woods with nothing but a decaying cabin. I thought I must have been on edge for reasons that were beyond me. Once the sun was going down, I headed inside, testing out the old wood stove. These things seemed to be undying as it fired up no problem and warmed up the cabin. I sat near it and just watched the flames, listening to it crackle as it hawed about everything. My dad, this trip, just life in general. But sometime later in the night, the crackles in the flame were suddenly accompanied by a similar sound, cracks and crunching coming from the front of the cabin. I turned my head and listened. That I only managed to realize it wasn't a wild animal and was definitely a person. Just as they got up to the front door, the wood stove suddenly felt like it was 1,000 times louder, preventing me from intently listening to whoever the hell was outside the cabin. Then they knocked and called out a name that made me whole world stopped for a moment. The man called out my dad's name. It felt like it just took hold of me, making me stand up and walk up to the other side of the door in complete shock. How did he know my dad? I couldn't resist calling out and asking who he was. The man outside hesitated. I think he knew after I spoke that it wasn't my dad. I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin. Was hoping I'd get to see him again. The unknown man spoke. I got a little closer to the door, the urge to pen it and have someone to talk to about my dad, to hear stories and everything. But still, something kept me from opening it. Why was he even here? I asked, and the man said he lived in that old town. After thinking for a second, I decided to share that I was the son of the man he was looking for. My dad, and he had passed away. The man behind the door paused. I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time. Initially, it felt nice to hear that, but I quickly sensed something was off about the way he said it. Something in his voice. It wasn't the sadness I was expecting from someone who just found out they lost a friend. Before I could say anything, and almost like he knew I was thinking too hard about it, the man continued talking. "Why don't you open and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire." Although he talked very slowly, I sensed an urgency or a lack of patience in his voice. Something in me felt he wasn't being truthful, that maybe he wasn't who he said he was. Sure, he knew my dad's name and was in the town he used to live in, but how did I know he was really a friend of his? Still, as I was thinking, I couldn't find what words to say next. And in my pause, the man asked again for me to pen up. He knocked on the door again, a little harsher. His voice grew less kind and more demanding. I took a few steps from the door, backing away. "Kid, open the door. You gonna let Mehdi out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you?" My heart began pounding as I dug into my backpack for my hunting knife. The man continued hitting the door and yelling subtle threats, discarding the fake identity off being a kind, harmless friend. This went on for much longer than I could keep track of. It felt like it never ended, some continuous nightmare. But suddenly, the man punched the door in anger, and it was followed by the sound of his footsteps walking away, going back into the woods. That I stayed up all night, mind racing as it waited in fear. But when the sun came upand with no signs of him around, I hurriedly packed my bag and ran from the cabin. I got really lucky, finding my car untouched, still well hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I fled from the town and drove nonstop back home. I was hoping with that trip I'd get some answers or come to terms with everything. But honestly, I'm just left with more questions. I realized I never even really knew why my dad moved away from there. I guess I assumed it was because the town was dying off and everyone else was leaving. But now I think there was probably more to it, and maybe there were other reasons that he'd never brought me back to his cabin. That I don't know why that man was still around there, or what he really wanted from me, or how he even knew my dad Adel. But something tells me he didn't have any good intentions that night. Hadi let my emotions get the better of me and opened the door to invite him in. I genuinely don't think I ever would have made it out of that town. In February of this year, I went to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee with my family, and we stayed in this adorable little cabin on a golf course. My parents, Nana, aunt, and her daughter, and my brother, his girlfriend, and my dad all went out to explore the woods, riding trails, and me, my sister, and my cousin all stayed at the cabin. About 30 minutes later, they left the three of us, and we were playing Cards Against Humanity and laughing and joking about the cards we kept getting when we heard a knock at the front door. Now, it's important to note that we were all sitting in the dining room. The dining room had about 8 to 10 windows around the room, one of which was pointing directly at the door. The door was angled towards the dining room. When the knock had happened, I had actually just gotten up to check on some cookies I had in the oven. So, I was at that point where I couldn't see the door, but they could. My sister started staring at the door, and my cousin was looking at me with such an unexplainable expression that kind of creeped me out. But I still set my mids down and went toke by the door. But about halfway there, my sister called me from the back door. Mind you, I can still see my sister at the dining room table, and whatever it was called me by my legal government first name. My sister has not called me by my legal name since she was probably in 3rd grade. When that happened, I was on high alert and realized I probably shouldn't open the door because duh. So I went and sat down and chose to ignore it. Now, the night before, I had called my older cousin to debrief a situation with my ex. During this call, I was sitting in a metal glider on the porch where the hot tub is because it felt like I was suffocating inside. As I'm sitting there, I noticed that on the golf cart bridge down from the hill, something is standing there looking directly at me. Now, at the time, I chalked it up to being a man standing there because that's not unusual for me. But as I'm finishing up my conversation with my cousin, I get this overwhelming sense of dread and danger, and I can't tell where it's coming from. So, I quietly got up and went inside and watched a movie. Funnily enough, after these events, we went to an exotic car exhibit in aquarium. Now, all was good there, nothing strange. But when we were driving through the mountains to get back to the cabin, that feeling of dread returned. It was so overwhelming. I was in physical pain from how heavy my chest felt. And about 5 minutes into the unbearable pain and sense of dread driving me nuts, it stopped. It just went away. No lingering ache in my chest, no dread, nothing. My parents were looking at me like they thought I needed a hospital visit. But my brother and his at the time girlfriend was leaning over the back seat making sure that I was good and didn't need anything. The whole thing was really weird and very disturbing. Can anyone help me figure out what this entity could be? Because 4 months later, I'm still going absolutely insane about it. Music. Back when I was 16, there wasn't much to do in our town. Boredom was a national sport, and it was famous for every road seeming to end in a field. It felt like every weekend blared into the next with the lack of anything interesting to fill it with. But my friend Jack had this small cabin out on the edge of a rundown caravan site. His parents technically owned it, though they hardly ever used it, which made it the perfect spot for us. No adults, no neighbors, just a space to drink cheap booze, play Xbox, and talk crap until the early hours. Wes spent most of our summer out there. Sometimes we liked to barbecue or have a little party, but mostly it was just the usual rotation of beer, bad jokes, and the comfort of knowing we were completely alone. Then came the night of Max's birthday. It was early September when the nights were just starting to get cold. Wes showed up with armfuls of snacks, a speaker, and a couple of lukewarm ciders. But by 10 o'clock, we were already running dry. Nathan and Tom, who were older than the rest of us, volunteered to walk to the nearest corner store to get more booze. It was a 20-minute trip each way, but none of us minded. The rest of us played in the cabin, half watching someone play FIFA and the rest just scrolling on our phones. 45 minutes had passed when we heard the first bang on the window. It was loud, like someone had slapped their entire palm against the flat of the glass. I grinned, assuming it was Nathan and Tom screwing with us, trying to freak us out. I pulled back the curtain, ready to flip them off, but there was no one there. Still grinning though, I stuck my tongue out to the night and let the curtain fall. The front door was unlocked. They could have come in whenever they wanted. But then another bang rang through the stillness of the night. Then 3 more rapid fire on the other side of the cabin on the back wall. Then on the glass again. Someone was circling us. Then a man's voice, deep and sharp. "Oh, you in there?" It wasn't Nathan and it wasn't Tom. Jack stood up slowly, walked over the front door. I started to say something, maybe to stop him, maybe to ask if he was sure. But words failed and they never left my mouth. He opened the door, and this man, Boldstock, in his mid-40s, grabbed Jack by the collar and yanked him out onto the steps. He was screaming in Jack's face, but I couldn't make out the words. There was more movement outside. Shadows kept darting past the windows, banging from every side of the cabin. Now, it sounded like 10 people or more were surrounding us. I remember one of them screaming again and again, "I'm going to kill him, I'm going to kill him," and we just stood there frozen. We didn't speak. Just 5 teenagers huddled in the corner of that crappy living room, backs pressed against the walls, staring at door Jack had been pulled through. And the guilt that didn't come until later. At the time, it was all panic. A thundering silence in my head drowned out every rational thought. I texted Nathan and Tom and told them not to come back, but it was already too late. They'd returned just as the men arrived and were now hiding out somewhere, maybe behind one of the caravans. Then, just like that, it stopped. The shouting, the banging, the sound of boots on dirt, gone, like someone had flipped a switch. We waited a full 5 minutes before daring to move. Jack and the men were gone. Eventually, we left the cabin in a kind of daze and started searching for him. We found him sitting alone at the edge of the caravan park near the river. His head in his hands, he looked so small. He didn't look injured or bleeding. We asked if he was okay. He didn't look up, just told us to get lost in no uncertain terms, and walked back in silence. Jack never came back to school after that. Word got around that he'd had some kind of breakdown, locked himself in his room, and barely spoken to anyone, not even his parents. That was the last Weaver heard of him. We never went back to the cabin. I still don't know who those men were or what they wanted or why they came so violently and left so quietly, but I think about it often, and I wonder if Jack ever got answers. I wonder if perhaps his parents were into something shady and they'd used him or attacked him or threatened him to make his parents give them what they wanted. IRL, I can't say for certain what it was all about, but it left me wondering, and the immense guilt of leaving him there and not trying to stand up for my friend, even though I probably would have been pulverized, also plays on me. Irrational, I know, but there you go. I still feel bad for the lad, and I hope, however he is now, he's doing better than he was then. This happened to me when I was around 11. I used to deliver packages for a shipping company in the Deep South. Most days that meant long hours alone on winding gravel roads that dipped through dense woods and open hills. Sometimes beautiful, other times just plain eerie. So, there was this one route, just one, and I still think about it almost every time I pass anywhere near it. It was late summer last year, and I had this delivery out near the edge of the county, deeper than I'd ever been before. The GPS pointed me down a narrow gravel road, barely wide enough for my box truck. I remember the sun was low and the woods were thick, pine and oak pressing in on either side. There were only a handful of houses along the way, scattered few and far between. Eventually, I reached the pin destination. But of course, there was no mailbox, no paved drive, not even a gravel turnout, just a faint path barely wide enough for a vehicle and worn into the weeds. It looked more like a hunting trail than anything meant for deliveries. I sat there in the cab for a moment, assessing. The driveway, if you could call it that, was about 250 yards long, snaking into the forest. Trees arched overhead like a tunnel, and the land dipped unpredictably on either side. My tires crunched slowly over the packed earth as I crept forwards, barely doing anything more than a crawl. If one wheel slipped, the whole truck would slide down into some ravine I couldn't see. As I crept along, I passed an old broken-down truck, one of those models from the 70s with the rusted-out fenders and flat tires that were so sunken into the earth it looked like the forest had grown around it. Further along, I passed not one but 4 discarded satellite dishes scattered like bones in the underbrush. That gave me pause. Who needs for satellite dishes out here? And why toss them out and leave them? And then finally I saw the house. It was a cabin. Well, more like a shack that had refused to collapse out of sheer stubbornness. The siding was warped, and the porch sagged in the middle. And the front door was an old wooden one with a single glass panel that was cloudy from time and grime. I parked and stepped out. Slowly, my eyes were sweeping the woods. There wasn't a sound, just the occasional insect in the wind. I approached the door and dropped the package and looked through the cloudy glass. I could make out a front room, but it appeared empty. There was nothing in there. No furniture, no decor. Just 2 old metal folding chairs that were unfolded both side by side, both facing one corner of the room. But the corner was bare. There was no TV, no table, no anything, just a wall. And the 2 chairs looked like they had been placed there deliberately. I didn't even knock. I dropped the package on the top step and turned back towards the truck. But with each step, I felt pressure like I wasn't alone. Something might be trailing me just a few steps behind. I made it to the truck and slammed the door behind me, locked it through a quick glance in the back to make sure I was still alone. Then I remembered the path, narrow and treacherous, and backed out slowly, sweat breaking, all over my neck despite the AC, and my eyes kept darting to the Treant. About 40 feet up the road, just before I turned back onto the main drag, I saw something in the road. A trash bag, not torn open or spilled, just sitting there like it had been placed deliberately. The top was slightly twisted open enough for me to see inside. I leaned forward and there was a woman's sweater neatly folded on the top that was pale blue. I flawed it. Once I got back to cell service, I called my buddy and told him everything. He urged me to return and take pictures, and against my better judgment, I did. It had been only 10 to 15 minutes and the trash bag was gone. Not dragged to the side, not crumpled, gone like it had never been there. I don't know what that house was. I don't know who lived there, and I didn't know what I walked into or what nearly walked out behind me. But it didn't feel right and didn't feel safe. That I told my supervisor, and he said he'd report it to the local sheriff's department and take the address off the route. But I never heard anything more. If the police went out there, maybe they found nothing. Maybe they didn't find what they were supposed to. Or maybe someone saw that I noticed too much and made sure they were ready next time. For a lot of reasons, not just the creepiness of this story, I quit a week later. Then I never want to find out what was waiting in that corner. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you. At the time of this story, I was 14. As well as being young, I had developed crippling anxiety and depression. And all I'll say is I was, and still am, very vigilant about my surroundings. On this day, I had planned to stay the night at a friend's house. I had never stayed at her place before. It was always mine. For you to understand this story, I need to explain the layout of this house. It was located on a sloped hill, and when you drove down a steep road, the first part of the house you would see was big and expansive. It looked like an old mansion. If you continued driving down, you would be met with two semi-separated buildings. Both were small and run down. And when I say small, I mean one of them was just a bedroom, and the other one was a bedroom and a small bathroom and a kitchen. No doors inside, just a piece of cloth and beads to separate the bathroom entrance from the kitchen. My friend's room was the bedroom, and her mom lived in the other section with the bathroom/kitchen. The landlord of the property lived in the main house too, the big mansion. It was located in the middle of the forest. And when I say that, I don't mean lightly. All that you could see was a massive expanse of Australian forest. These are incredibly dense, and if you tried to trek through it, you would likely receive some sort of bite, whether it be from spider, ant, or leech. I'll cut to the first thing that happened. Me and my friend had walked into her mom's flat. I can't remember why, and called out for her. She was in the bathroom, and as we walked past the small window, I heard, "Yeah," coming from outside. I turned to my friend and she looked at me in the same way. I was confused. If her mom was in the bathroom that was right in front of us, why did we hear a male voice coming from right outside? We brushed this off as to not scare ourselves and continued to have fun in my friend's room. For a little more context, the landlord used half of her room as storage and blocked off the back section of the room with a tall shelf and divider. There was a huge glass sliding door at the front of the room, and in the blocked off back section, there was another door. You couldn't get out that door unless you squeezed through a section outside. Now, skipping forward a little to nighttime, me and my friend had to go to the bathroom. So, we slinked out of her room and walked to her mom's flat. Her mom was fast asleep. We used the bathroom as quietly as possible and then exited. As we were making the small walk back to my friend's room, we saw something out in the woods. A pair of eyes looking directly at us from behind a tree. We panicked and froze. I pulled out my phone and took a photo before Wes sprinted back into her room, locking the glass door behind us and drawing the curtains. It's not a reach to say we were already freaking out. I looked at the photo and sure enough, when I brightened the image, there was what looked to be like a man staring at us from the dark woods. We were extremely scared, But I called my mother, who was about an hour away, and she dismissed us. Sure, after that, we were still scared, but it was little comforting. After a while, we relaxed and chalked it up to our imagination playing tricks on us. We pulled up my laptop and put on a movie. I forget which, but it was some cheesy rom-com. Maybe 20 to 30 minutes into the movie, we froze and paused it. Footsteps crunching on dry leaves outside her room. We listened in horror as the footsteps moved through the tight alley that led to the back door. We both moved slowly, standing on the bed to look over the room divider. Our eyes were locked on the back door, and after a moment of complete silence, it turned. The door knob wiggled slowly before it became faster. The door couldn't beepend as it was jammed against objects that were in storage. Then it stopped. No more noise. We were crying, holding each other in our arms, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then the footsteps slowly crunched on the leaves in the opposite direction back to the front of her room. We both hesitate now and I rack for my phone. We called the police, and after trying to explain the situation to the operator on the other end while in tears the whole time, she told us a unit was being dispatched and to stay where we were. Then, as we were still crying and hyperventilating, we heard a phone ring. It sounded like an old landline phone, one with the harsh and loud beeping. It was coming from the landlord's mansion. We waited silently, listening to the drawn-out ringing of his phone. After what felt like at least 2 minutes, it stopped and we heard his voice as he talked to the operator. At this time, we both noticed another thing. Fingerprints on the window. These windows were slated glass that you could open up and shift with a lever. Whoever left these prints reached up, cupid their hand around the top of the glass, and dragged their fingers on the dust as they weren't there before. Soon, the landlord walked to her mother's unit and told her that the police called him. He seemed extremely upset and told her that he made sure they didn't send a unit. Her mother came to her room and we explained the situation. Both the landlord and her mother didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that a man just tried to enter our room. I couldn't stay the night and neither could my friend. We were too afraid to spend another minute there. I called my mom and she arrived to pick me up nearly at midnight. We dropped my friend back the next day. And when we got there, her mother told us something I don't think I can pass up as coincidence. The night it happened, it was raining and there was a strong wind, but nothing strong enough to do this. Next to her mother's unit, she had a pole that held beads and fairy lights. During that night, right after me and my friend were picked up, it had been knocked down. Keep in mind, the pole was literally embedded into the cement and tied up with other items, zip ties. So, there's no way it could have just been the wind. I'm unsure of the explanation of all of this. Could have been her landlord, but I'm not too sure. It could also have been an ex-stepfather who was pretty insane. But either way, I hope to never meet the crazed man who tried to break into the room of 2 young girls. Years old in Willow Creek, Oregon. It still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it, even though it's been over a decade. It was early December and my stepdad Travis decided we should go on a short weekend getaway to a cabin near a lake that he thought it would be a good bonding experience for me, him, my mom, and my stepsister Marley, who was 12 at the time. My mom was all for it. No school, no phones, just nature. We left early Friday morning and got there before sunset. The place was definitely isolated. Tall trees, icy lake, and not a single neighbor in sight, as far as I could tell. The cabin was decent, not fancy, but warm and had this old stove that filled the place with the smell of burnt wood. That night, while everyone was asleep, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought perhaps it was an animal, but the steps were slow, like a crunching in the snow that I looked out the window and didn't see anything. But the sound kept coming back every 10 to 15 minutes. Eventually, I woke up Marley and we both looked outside together. There was someone there, just barely visible in the trees. We couldn't see a face, just a silhouette that we both immediately backed away from the window and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I asked my mom if I could go outside with Travis while she made breakfast. Marley stayed by in the fireplace. Outside, Travis was clearing snow off the porch and talking to a man I didn't recognize. The guy was short, stocky, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, and wore a heavy camo jacket in a canvas hunting cap. The weird thing was he was sweating a lot, even though it was freezing cold. Travis didn't seem weirded out at all. He introduced the guy as Donnie and said he was staying in a cabin just a short walk away and stopped to say hi. I remember asking him, "Are you all right? You look nervous." Donnie laughed awkwardly and said something like, "Ah, just some old Marine nerves. Cold weather messes with me." I guess he was trying to be funny, but even at that age, I remember thinking he seemed weird. Travis invited him in for breakfast. Donnie stayed for eggs and pancakes and made small talk. I was suspicious, but nothing he said set off alarms yet. After breakfast, we went back outside top lay in the snow, and at one point, I slipped and scraped my knee on a rock under the snow. I didn't cry, but Travis ran inside to get something. Donnie immediately knelt beside me and said, "I've got something for that in my cabin. Come with me and I'll fix you." I wish I could have said I knew better, but I was 11 and my knee hurt, so I decided to go with him. We walked through the trees for a while. I kept expecting to see another cabin pop into view, but it was way deeper than I expected. Easily a 20-minute walk. When we finally got there, the place looked like it hadn't been taken care of in years. Boarded up window, blue tarp hanging off the roof. It just felt wrong. He told me to go in first, and I hesitated. The inside was cold and dark and smelled awful, and no lights were on, and there were no sounds. He got a Band-Aid from an old box and started patching up Mickney, and he kept his hand on my leg for way too long. "You got strong legs for a kid. That's good." I wanted to leave right then, but he kept smiling and saying things like, "Why don't we hang out? I've got snacks and toys." He started asking weird questions, how much I weighed, and other things that started to creep me out. As he went over to grab something from the other room, I had seriously had enough and I booked it out of there. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran and I could hear him yelling not long after. I didn't stop. I was freezing, panicked, and just kept going straight, hoping it would eventually take me back to where I came from. Eventually, after about 15 minutes off running, I saw our cabin through the trees and I ran straight into Travis crying and I told him everything. Travis called the rental office and the guy on the phone said there was no other cabin rented that weekend. Ours was the only active rental in the area. That afternoon, the owner called Travis back and said he sent someone to check out the cabin I described. When they found it, no one was there. That cabin didn't belong to him. It looked like someone had been living in it, though. Dirty clothes, old food, camping gear, no IDs or sign of anyone. We never got any more info, and there was no police follow-up. To this day, I didn't know who Donnie really was or what he was planning to do to me, but I know this. Everything he said was BS. And I'm lucky to get away. I hope I never see that man again. So, my girlfriend and her friends invited me to stay at a small cabin Airbnb in the Appalachian Mountains near Seven Devils. The idea was to just go up there to enjoy some snow tubing and then some light drinking, hot tub, and board games in the cabin after. So, the cabin was pretty high up in the mountains and the drive up to it was kind of scary. Single car length roads for the most part, no railings on the side of the road, and if you were on the side of the trucks, which we rented a four-wheel drive to make the drive up, thank goodness it was a sheer drop on that side. Sure, if we drove off the road, we'd likely be stopped on some trees on the way down, but still a bit nerve-wracking. Another thing was some of the trees on the trail had faces on them for decoration. I think they were supposed to look cute, but they looked kind of unnerving for most of us. I really should have taken pictures, but was too anxious during the climb. The cabin itself was almost at the top of the mountain and fairly small. A small living room with a very tiny and narrow kitchen and 2 bedrooms. Hot tub on the lower porch because the cabin itself was basically on the 2nd floor. So you had to go up the stairway to get to it. The keys to the cabin were in a lockbox, so no special lock option, just an old-fashioned cabin. So we came back after snow tubing and dinner. The others drank enough to get buzzed, while I only had a glass of wine since I have a condition that makes it dangerous to get too much alcohol in my system. So, relatively sober. Enjoying the hot tub as planned, I witnessed a beautiful shooting star, then played ball games after that until around 1 a.m. and we all went to bed. I woke up a little after 4 a.m. because I was suddenly sweating and then I felt kind of unsettled. I decided I need to go to the bathroom. So I got up. I left the bedroom and nothing seemed to miss. So I used the bathroom. When I left the bathroom, the front door was wide open. Naturally, I felt immediately uneasy. But again, this was a small cabin, so there was nowhere for any intruder to hide. I could easily see the entire interior of the cabin from the tiny hallway. And I decided that maybe the last person through the door last night after the hot tub didn't fully close the door and lock it appropriately because there's a sign by the door that says close door firmly and it was fairly windy outside. I mean, that wind was howling out there. So I go over the door and close it, making sure that it's firmly enough to the doorway to fully lock it. I even jiggle the handle a few times and try to see if it'll open when locked, but it doesn't budge. So I start to head back to the room. Then, I hear the door rattle a little bit and I turn around and stare at it. I watch the lock itself turn and then the door opens and it doesn't slam open from the wind. It just slowly swung open. I stayed extremely still because of course that was crazy. The door has a huge clear window on it with no curtains and a big window beside it that also doesn't have curtains, and there was absolutely no onion the other side of it. There's no way someone could have ducked out of view either and hurried away from the door after pushing it open either, because they would have had to make a lot of noise hurrying down the steps to get off the walkway. Like I said, it was an old-fashioned door as well as a simple lock and knob. No electronic buttons or anything to unlock or lock by buttons remotely. After getting the nerve to close the door again and lock it firmly, nothing else happened that night. I couldn't really go back to sleep because I was just too scared to do so. The following morning, I told the others about it, and they were pretty spooked, too. But otherwise, glad we were only staying that one night. Before we packed up the truck to leave, there was this strange knocking noise coming from the surrounding woods. Not like someone knocking on a wall or door. It was a deep hollow knocking noise that only knocked twice, stopped for a while, and would then do it again. Maybe it was just trees knocking together. But after what happened early in the morning like that, it was a bit unsettling. So yeah, I'm from Florida, and though I've experienced other strange activity before, that was the most physical thing I've ever experienced. I've definitely heard plenty of stories about odd occurrences in the Appalachians. And in a way, I'm glad I've experienced something, but I'll never forget the fear I felt. After all, my first instinct was an intruder, and it would have been pretty bad being up there that high by ourselves. If we had any reason to run, we could have easily fallen off a cliff or something in the pitch darkness of outside. Before I was born, my parents built a cabin in the northern White Mountains of Arizona. As a kid, we would go up there every chance we got. Summer break was spent up there, Memorial Day, etc. My parents had friends up there with kids my age, and we'd always run around the woods hanging out and just being kids. We used to tell scary stories of an old abandoned property down the way from all our cabins, but we would never go there. You could not miss the property if you tried. Going down the dirt road to our cabin, there was this giant field on the left. Right in the middle of it was a large property that was clearly abandoned and had been for decades. It had quite a few structures on it, namely a large green 2-story barn, a red airplane hangar, and a white tractor barn. It also had a house nestled up on a hill with the only tree on the entire property. The house looked eerie with its broken windows and peeling paint. The tree was always filled with crows. As a kid, we would never dare to go in there. We would maybe venture towards the front of the property line if we were really daring. As teenagers wanting an adrenaline fix, we thought we would finally venture over there. By my sophomore year of high school, we began to go to the property routinely. We even went there at night a few times and explored the many different buildings on the property, always curious on what we would find inside. We found a bunch of odd things there. But one day, I opened the drawer and gasped at what was in it. There was this old workshop building that had an old workbench. And I curiously opened the drawer, and within was a Jar Jar Binks notebook that I had when I was a kid. It was mine, as it had my childhood chicken scratch all over it and drawings I had made. My name was written within it, and so were the names of my siblings, as we used it to keep score on several games. Dumbfounded that it was within this workshop, I thumbed through it and found some handwriting I didn't recognize on the last few pages. None of my friends nor siblings knew how it got there or whose handwriting it was at the back. In hindsight, we should have taken this as a sign to stop coming there, but we didn't. We continued going to the abandoned property to explore it and get away from our parents. By this point, we had made a top portion of the workshop into a hangout spot. We would hear floorboards creak and other scary noises, but we never let it get to us. We always thought we could take on anything that came our way. Thinking back to how I acted when I was that age, I never was scared of anything. I was always the first one to go investigate when something sounded amiss. Hell, I was the first one to suggest we go over there. Other than the weird appearance of the notebook, nothing really stopped me or any of us from going there until the summer of my junior year in 2012. I was 16 and about to turn 17 in July, and had grown a new fondness for dirt biking and the freedom it would give me. I had started riding early in that year over spring break with my best friend Logan. He started me out on a little Honda 125 cubic centimeters, and we would ride all over the dirt roads and up in the woods. He rode a 1994 Suzuki DR200, an old Japanese enduro bike that was fully outfitted with a headlight and speedometer, and I worked my butt off to get to the point where he would comfortably let me ride it. And eventually I did. I absolutely loved having more power, a light for when it got dark, and the ability to tell how fast I was going and push it a little more every day. On this day, we had spent the majority of the day riding the bikes down our normal trails. We had finally gotten a break from all the rain as the monsoon had come in, and it would rain just about every day. Logan and I were giddy that we had this day to romp the bikes around and never got covered in mud or soaking wet. We'd been riding since the morning and both decided that we would end the day over at the abandoned barn. Logan had been there plenty of times with me and hadn't been there in a week or so. So close to sunset, we had stopped at my parents' cabin to get some water and eat dinner quickly, hopped on our bikes, and started to make our way to the property. Being on the bigger, faster bike, I beat Logan to the property by a few minutes. That I pulled into the long driveway and turned around right in front of the hangar so that I could watch Logan pull in and we could decide what we were going to do from there. I let the bike idle, and to my left was the green workshop in front of me, and about 20 feet was this old white tractor barn. It was in bad shape. The door had fallen off years prior and had crumbled to dust by the time we started going over there. On both sides of the barn were huge 15-foot doors for big equipment to get in and out of. And on the left of the door was a small regular-sized door for someone to go in. Since all the doors had fallen off the barn, you could see right through the large doors right to the other side. There were also 3 windows on each wall of the barn. However, you could not see on the left side of the regular-sized door since the door was about 2 feet in from the wall. This is an important detail to help you visualize what I saw that night. As I'm sitting there in front of this white tractor barn, I'm looking out towards the driveway, which was to the left of the barn. Waiting for Logan to pull up, I never felt uneasy or panicked. I just sat there patiently. At this point in time, I was pretty comfortable with being on the property alone. I'm looking out towards the driveway when I see something large move in the tractor barn from the corner of my eye. I turn my head quickly and look at the barn, and I see nothing at first, so I don't think much of it and turn back towards the driveway waiting for Logan. As I'm sitting there, I start to overthink. Even though I saw something move Tobjin with and I began freaking myself out, I reassured myself. Surely my eyes were just playing tricks on me. My eyes has started to drift away from the road and towards the barn. I became transfixed on it. And then I saw a pale, skinny white hand place itself on the left side of the regular door. I see this and I genuinely don't know what to make of it, but I can't move. I'm sitting on the bike, completely still watching. And then I see another hand placed below it. And before I have to process the other hand on the frame, I see a head poke around the corner. It's looking at me. I become paralyzed with fear. My ears start to ring and my head couldn't make sense of what was looking at me. It was an extremely pale man with eyes darker than anything I'd ever seen in my life. It was hiding mossed off its body behind the wall and was just peering around the corner looking straight to me. I began to panic, but I couldn't look away, couldn't even move. I remember thoughts running through my mind, telling myself this couldn't be real, and I was just seeing things. Then I noticed something that would confirm this was real. In its eyes were the reflections of my headlights in the dirt bike. Then I knew there is no way this is my imagination. My heart started to beat faster and I started to sweat. There was no way I was going to take my eyes off whatever this thing was. The only thing I can compare it to is probably Gollum from Lord of the Rings. That's the only comparison I can make of this thing. And as it couldn't get any worse, I saw it open its mouth and smile. At this point, I was too scared to think that my life was in danger. I think I hadn't felt threatened by it, more just unnerved. And I was scared looking at it because I genuinely had no idea what this thing was. Once I saw its teeth looking at me, I knew I had to get the hell out of there. I knew whatever this thing was, entity, person, animal, it wanted to do harm. Right as I made the decision to put the bike in gear and hit the road, I heard Logan's dirt bike and saw him pull up to the driveway. I threw my bike into first gear and gunned off the line, yelling at him to turn around and leave. Before he could even ask why, I was already past him at the end of the driveway. I looked back and saw him quickly turning the bike around and start hauling ass towards me. We got back to my cabin and I was completely panicked, sweating, panting, and just terrified. Logan pulled in right behind me and I could see he had wide eyes and was spooked as well. When he was turning around on the side of the barn, he saw something looking at him through the side window. Before I could start to describe what it was, he beat me to it, saying he saw black beady eyes looking out at him. We both saw the same thing, and it was only confirmed that whatever was out there was real. Neither of us went back to the property again, and a few years ago it was brought and a lot of the structures were torn down, including the old tractor barn where this thing was. I'm 25 now and I still go up to the cabin all the time. In fact, I was there just last weekend. Sharing the story has made me relive the event all over again. And I've told this story before to my siblings and some off-me friends. It never fails to make me tear up thinking about the true terror I felt that day. Whatever I saw was real, and it haunts me to think about it. There have been weird things that have happened in our cabin, but those stories are for another day. And every time I'm alone out on the porch looking into the darkness of the pasture, I can't help but think about the thing I saw 9 years ago that will probably haunt me until the day I die. I live in North Carolina in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains on most days. Sometimes nights, it's very peaceful, but there is always a dense atmosphere in some areas. This story is back from October of 2023. I was struggling with mental issues from family life, and me and my family decided to book a cabin between Banner Elk, Beach Mountain, and Boone. I think it was called Bayes. A very nice town. I hope it still is. And the cabin was a 2-story log cabin upon a very steep mountain road and a 1-lane road, at least a mile from any building, if not more. It was very nice there. We settled in and my father had to watch our neighbor's dog back in Troutman. Me and my mom and my brother and sister, both 1 year old, had arrived a day before. It was raining, and as I said, with the leaves and crisp autumn mountain air, it was serene, but it was raining nonetheless. My mom was always an outdoor person, and so was I. We settled in, relaxed, and just got the cabin ready. I helped my mom put the babies to bed and settled down on the couch for a bit. There was a deck in the back around 8 to 9 foot tall and a hot tub against the wall with the staircase down to the right and the wall from the left and railing behind. Me, being impatient, asked my mom if we could go to the hot tub even though my dad wasn't there yet, and surprisingly yet reasonably she sighed no. This is reasonable as there are a lot of black bears around here a lot. The next day when my dad came here, we went into the woods behind the house and collected wood for a fire and did other father-son cabin activities that anyone else in a cabin would do. Fast forward to the evening. We planned on going into the hot tub. We ate dinner and had a fire inside. It was too windy outside. Afterwards, we decided to go inside in the hot tub. We're all facing the backside of the staircase on the hot tub. It was nice, but you know the feeling you get when you're being watched? Yeah, me and my dad got that, but it wasn't said until later. My mom had me take a picture of her and me dad. They were both facing towards the railing, the one overlooking the forest. I snapped a few pictures and just got a weird sense of dread. So, me and my dad said, "Let's go inside." I sat down on the couch for a bit and my dad went out to smoke outside on the front porch. Like normally, I thought it would be relaxing to sit out there with him, so I did. I was talking about how secluded it was, and my dad was talking about plans of where we could go hunting and fishing the next day. Then he got a message from Mom. My mom had sent the photos to her friend, and she pointed out something and sent it to Mom. My dad showed me the picture and zoomed in. It looked like a young Native American woman with a headdress in the background, indistinguishable face, but unnaturally tall. I was in shock, but nothing prepared me for what I would see and hear next. While looking at the photo, I heard loud rustling like deer, and my dad didn't seem to notice. I looked up and saw branches, except they weren't. They were antlers at the height of an old oak tree. I saw a literal goddamn deer skull staring at me for a few seconds, and I called my dad in a horrified, shaky voice. I heard an animal dash away and told him to get his flashlight. He began yelling at me to come inside. He turned on his large flashlight and we heard more bolting away. We ran inside. My dad got a shotgun, saying to my mom that she's going to shoot that thing, whatever it is, with her telling him no. I was visibly shaken, having a severe panic attack for at least an hour, and we left the next day. But after my mom and I did research and found an article about the area with an image of a Native American woman with the exact same face as the image, headdress and all. The article said something along the lines of, after a war between two neighboring tribes, one tribe caught a woman off another and scalped her, beheaded her just down the valley beyond the porch. I get chills. While I was there, since I got a new pocket knife, for some reason I carved a spear and I wasn't thinking and brought it home. And on the way, I started acting weird and seeing things. I can't remember anything, but me mom recalled me screaming, "It's coming, it's here," repeatedly. I then experienced extreme torment until February of 2024, having to be baptized, embalmed with holy water and other things. We quickly got rid of the spear. It's very clear that the land is native land, and I don't think they welcomed us. I live in a regional city on Australia. It's relatively big, but once you leave the center of the city, it's pretty much all bushland and trees. When I was in year 3, which makes me between 7 and 8 years old, my school took all of the year on a school camp to a campground 45 minutes out of town. It was a one-night trip and we were all very excited. After a long day of archery, basketball, tennis, and all the other things you do on camps, we had dinner and went to bed. I distinctly remember laughing and messing around with all my friends before we fell asleep at around 11:00. Now for the next part, one had forgotten for years until recently it came back to my mind, and now it's the clearest part of my memory. I used to be terrified of the dark and used to wake up multiple times at night. At this certain instance, I woke up in me cabinet around 2 a.m. I remember this as I had a watch and it was very special to me. And for some reason, looking at it and checking the time always comforted me in the dark. When I woke up, I felt like something was off. Not wrong, but off. I looked around my cabin and saw nothing of interest. But then I was stuck with such an intense feeling to look out the window, which was right next to my bed. Our room was on the second level of this cabin complex, so when you looked out the window, you had to look down to the ground directly below you. When looking out the window, I saw nothing. And when I started to look away, something caught my eye. I could have sworn I saw something right below it, almost out of sight if you were simply looking forward. I looked down and saw someone. Not the average person, more like a tweaker standing at around 6 feet 4 inches. His skin looked like he had just fallen hard on cement. He was covered in scrapes and grazes, and his hair had been buzzed off. He looked to be about 40, but could have been mid-20s based on his super skinny build. He wore a dirty black hoodie and dark jeans that looked like motorbike pants. He also wore what looked like a mix between a fedora and a cowboy hat. When I looked down, his eyes caught mine instantly. He was staring into the window. Hadn't moved his head there when he saw me. No, he had been actively staring into that window before I was even there. He stared with such wide eyes, like he was straining all the muscles in his face to pop his eyes out as much as possible. The second we locked eyes, I ducked back down and hid under the covers. I wanted to scream and yell and tell my friends, but I was so scared that I couldn't even move. I waited under those covers for what felt like hours until it felt like I was safe. I slowly peeked out of the covers again and checked the window. He was still there. He had moved a bit to the right, but he was still present, staring intently at the window. I didn't even get to become fully level with the window until I ducked out of sight again and went back under the covers, whimpering. I'm not sure how, but I managed to fall asleep. When I woke up, it was light out and all my friends were happily waking up from sleep. I woke up and checked the window again, praying Hugh was gone, and he was. I told my friends about it in the morning, and they all laughed at me for having a nightmare. And I think I believed it. I forgot about it for 10 years. But when it came back to me the other week, I realized it couldn't have been a dream. Everything was so real. I have very weird dreams, never having one that actually makes sense. My dreams always flow so strangely, so the absolute consistency is almost proof to me that this actually happened. So I specifically remember laying under my cover for ages, something I doubt would happen in a dream. I have no idea who was outside my window or what he was doing. I just hope he isn't continuing with what it was, because that look in his eyes told me that whatever he was doing there, he wasn't messing around. I don't know what I saw exactly. I just wish I had an answer. My brothers and I were 8, 7, and 4 when this happened. As such, my youngest brother, who was 4 at the time, had no recollection of this day. I was 8 and I remember most of what happened because I know I scared my pops and uncle and parents more than I've ever seen them scared before or since. First, I need to give you some background. 4 times a year, we spend at a family cabin that we own that we call the castle. The castle sits on a man-made dam called Wangala in New South Wales, Australia. My brothers and I always had the same rules to follow growing up. We couldn't go past the valley at the bottom of the castle or past the hill that the castle sat between. The day this happened, we broke those rules. On this trip, we had our nan and pop, mom and dad, and 2 uncles. 5 a.m. on the same day in question. My brothers and I were up dressed and playing Bob the Builder cones and ladders. Nam was complaining about us waking her up and told us to go play but be back before breakfast at 7:30. Keep in mind this was in 2004 in the middle of nowhere, Australia. The biggest danger to us were kangaroos, maybe snakes, and a spider. Being the big sister, my job was to watch my little brothers and make sure we followed the rules. But for some reason this day, we thought it would be cool to walk past the valley and up the hill onto the other side and stand on top to watch the sun come over the water of the dam. I confidently decided that we could watch the sun come up and be back in time for breakfast, and if we stayed on the road that went over the valley that could just be seen from the castle at all times if someone were to look for us. So we set off on our journey. After this, I have no idea what happened. Be it a glitch in the Matrix or a time slip or something else. Either way, we made it to the top of the hill. The sun was coming up and everything was great. We were there for no more than 10 minutes, and according to my wristwatch that I had, it must have been around 6:00 a.m. So we set off back down the hill. We reached the valley. We stepped to look at it for a minute. We could see the bottom clear as day and decided, as most kids, we would venture down the alley. We could see the bottom clear as day and decided, as most young kids, to venture down the valley and back out the other side. We have an hour and a half to kill, and surely it wouldn't take that long. So off we went. We had to zigzag back and forth to avoid thorn bushes, loose rocks, and spin effects, aspicy and painful grass, but tried to stay as straight as possible. When we reached the bottom, I checked our time, and it was roughly 6:15. We looked at the other side, and to our surprise, our Nan was sitting on the edge of the valley. She waved down at us. We thought we were going to get yelled at, but she just smiled and walked away. We thought we were in the clear. We started our way back doing much the same as before. We were laughing and talking about whatever kids talk about when we finally made it up out the valley. Just as we walked out onto the road, Nan came screaming at us from the castle. She was demanding to know where we'd been. I looked at my brothers and back at her before pointing at the valley. Too scared to speak, Nan pulled us all into a hug and, to our surprise, started weeping. She started telling us we needed to get into the car so we could go find our grandfather, parents, and uncles. Apparently, they were all off searching for us. We didn't say anything, just followed her. It wasn't until we were all seated in the car when we saw the time on her dashboard. It was apparently now 7 p.m., and rather than the sun rising, it was setting. I looked down at my watch and it showed the same time. I remember showing it to my 7-year-old brother, who was just as confused. February last year, our Nan passed rather unexpectedly, and at her funeral, my dad asked if we remember the day we vanished. He even joked about it, that if it were him and our uncle, he'd bet his last dollar she wouldn't have cared because we were her precious grandkids. She was beyond terrified. My youngest brother had no clue what we were talking about, but my other brother and I do remember. We told Dad what happened from our point of view. He told us that no one, not even Nan, had seen us. He told us Nan never left the castle for fear we might return and no one would know we were there. He then filled us in on their side of the story, which we never knew. Apparently, Mom had gotten up around 6:30 when she realized my brothers and I were being too quiet. She looked around the castle in our little hideouts. She even apparently called out to us with no answer. She then woke up everyone to help her search. Mom then went to the ranger station to get their help, searching while Dad started walking the hills and Pops took the four-wheeler drive-tra. My uncle was offered to check the other cabins, the caravan parks, and the boat shed. In reality, they went to get fish and chips in the caravan park, and then the next town over to get ice cream and beer. Buddy V's and stated they knew we would turn up, so weren't worried. Nan stayed at the castle, and Mom and Dad both swear they looked in the valley and never saw us. Since last year, my brothers have been to investigate the valley, and even Dad went and had a look, and no one can figure out how we could have been hidden from sight. And even by some chance we were hidden from sight, weren't heard. Our youngest brother said that even when our other brother was down in the valley, he could hear him clear as day. Even if we did somehow end up out off-site and out of hearing range, there's no way it would have taken us all day to walk back up the other side of the valley. We've walked it plenty of times since, and it's only taken us half an hour at most. And who did we see if it wasn't Nan, because it sure as hell looked like our Nan. When I was around 8 years old, I was playing with my little cousin at their parents' house during a family gathering. Behind their house is a large forest located in northeast Florida. My cousins, their neighbor, and I were playing hide and seek in the forest, and the only rule their parents had was to stay within the sight of the house. Of course, we didn't listen. I was getting bored of the game and wanted to do some exploring. I convinced the other kids to join me as we headed deeper into the forest. I noticed this ball of light floating in midair. I thought I was seeing things. I remember rubbing my eyes just to make sure it wasn't in my head. And I asked my cousins if they saw it too. And when I pointed it out, they confirmed it was there. It was bright and bobbed back and forth, changing from a yellowish color to a transparent green hue. We followed it for I can't remember how long, but we reached a small cabin and the orb disappeared. It was now dusk at this point, and curiosity got the best of me. My cousins and the neighbor kid were too scared to go in, but I peeked inside the window. I saw a dim light inside through a window, and what it hot was a human skull sitting on the table next to some jars. Then a shadow from within moved across the far wall, and I immediately took off behind them. We ran as fast as we could and didn't stop until we were inside their house, and I locked the door behind us. I remember getting in trouble because our parents couldn't see us from the kitchen window. And I didn't tell my mom or anyone else what I saw because I didn't want to scare my cousins or worry migrants. I'll be frank, I'm not even sure what to think. Later that night, I woke up to the sounds of helicopters and dogs barking outside. It was well past midnight, and I asked my mom, who was standing in the kitchen with the rest of the adults that stayed over the after party, what was going on. They all had their eyes glued to whatever was happening in the backyard through the kitchen window. They said they found a body of a woman in the forest and a cabin where her killer was staying, and there was a manhunt going on. I remember not being able to sleep for the rest of the night and the glaring white lights that shone through the folds of the blinds from the helicopters above. I'm still not sure what that orb was. Maybe it was the spirit of the woman who was trying to lead someone to her killer. I'm not even sure if one of the other kids told anyone about the cabin we saw, and if it was one of the parents that called the police. I just remember not being able to go anywhere near the tree anymore when we visited after that night. I never wanted to go anyway. I'm 24 now. I actually forgot of this and remembered while reading something about will-o-wisps and thought I'd share. The first time I saw the cabin, I was halfway up a dry creek bed in the Blue Ridge stretch of the Appalachians. I was trying to loop back to the trail I'd somehow veered off. One wrong turn and I'd wandered downhill, thinking I was circling back. Instead, I realized I was deeper in than before. It's easy to get turned around out there. The landscape folds into itself, ridge after ridge, like waves in slow motion. Each one just familiar enough to be convincing and just different enough to betray you. I wasn't panicking.
I've hiked plenty.
I bushwhacked my way back to trails before. I figured I'd just climb up until I crossed the ridge and picked up a marker cannon. Worst case, I backtrack once I hit the top. But then I saw the cabin.it slouched between two poplars, just visible through a break in the underbrush. No trail, no signs, nothing that suggested anyone had ever walked to it. It looked like something the woods had merely swallowed, like the trees had closed around it to keep it hidden, and somehow I was standing there staring straight at it. It looked wrong, not just old or abandoned. Wrong. I've seen plenty of old homesteads and hunting shacks out here, the kind that collapse under snow and time with rusted tools still hanging on the porch and deer skulls nailed the beams. Those make sense. This one didn't. The cabin didn't belong where it was. It looked dropped there, crooked and half-sunken. Its roof bowed in the middle like soaked cardboard. No porch. No windows on the side. I could see. Just a single door and a roof trying its best not to give up. And I walked straight to it. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe something dumber. I remember thinking, if it's this far out, maybe there's something cool left inside. Old tools, maybe a coin jar tucked in the floorboards. That kind of hope you get when you're far from anyone and find something untouched. The door didn't want to open. The wood was dark and swollen, soaked 100 times and dried just enough to warp. I pressed and it pushed back. When I leaned in with my shoulder, the latch gave with a crack, and the whole door lurched open at once, like it was tired of pretending to stay shut. The air inside hit me. It was warm, not the faint warmth of sun-soaked walls. This was humid, close warmth, like someone had been breathing in there for hours. It was one room, just one. A stone fireplace sat in the far corner, cold and unused. A narrow table leaned to the side, one leg propped with airlock. Shelves were nailed unevenly into the walls, slapped together without care for spacing or symmetry. But that wasn't what got me. It was the jars. Dozens of glass jars, some wide, some tall. Cloudy fingerprints smeared across the surface. Each sealed, each carefully spaced like they mattered to someone. I thought they held preserves, pickled vegetables maybe, but there was no dust, no cobwebs, nothing that said, "This has been here for years." I stepped closer. Inside wasn't vegetables. Floating in the cloudy brine were scraps, fragments off something soft and pale. Some jars held fat globs that clung to the glass like wet wax. Others had stringy bits that twisted in slow motion when bumped. I blinked, leaned in, tried to read the labels. Handwritten, faded pencil. Tongue knuckles. Knuckles. My stomach folded. Some words were smeared, maybe on purpose. Others clearer cartilage, throat, scalp. Each label scrawled in a hurry by unsteady hands. I backed away so fast my boot slammed the warped floor. Nearly fell. I grabbed the wall to steady myself, brushed a shelf, and one jar shifted with a wet clink. I didn't waste time. I stepped out, slammed the door behind me, but it didn't feel like leaving. The air outside was heavier. The trees felt closer. The ridge seemed leaned in. The creek downhill should have been straightforward. I was sure I was going the right way. I felt the slope, heard the trickle of water, but everything had shifted. Trees leaned at strange angles, roots twisted up from the ground like they'd been flipped inside out. The trail, if there had ever been one, was gone. I kept walking, and 20 minutes later, maybe less, I saw the cabin again. Same slouch, same warped roof. But this time, the door was open. It froze. My chest locked. I knew I hadn't turned back. I've been moving away. But there it was, straight ahead. I didn't want to approach. Every instinct screamed, "Run!" But I couldn't. Something in me had to see, had to confirm it wasn't worse. I crept close enough to look inside. The shelves had more jars. A new row stretched along the top, neat and orderly. I stared at them one by one. My eyes landed on the middle jar. Inside was cloth, red plaid, the same pattern as the shirt I was wearing. I don't even remember backing up. My legs moved on their own. Next thing I knew, I was sprinting. The woods didn't want me gone. Roots caught my boots. Branches snagged my pack. I fell hard, scraped my palms, tore my knee, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Everything was wrong. Tilted too quiet, like the air had muffled itself. Landmarks betrayed me. A rock I'd passed earlier was split in half. A tree I'd marked was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. The more I looked, the more the forest warped, flexing under some hidden weight. Then he heard water. The creek. Real or not, I chased it. I slid down the bank, half tripping, bleeding, panting. I followed the water line until the trees broke. There was the parking lot, my car, right where I'd left it. Relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. I didn't cry, but I could have. I dropped my pack, popped the trunk with shaking hands, ready to throw everything in and leave. But something was sitting in the trunk. One jar, same cloudy liquid, same smudged glass, and inside, folded with precise neatness, was a strip of red plaid cloth. The same pattern, the same wear along the hem, just sitting there like it had always been mine. I stood frozen, not breathing, not blinking. Then I slammed the trunk shut, got in the car, and drove. Didn't check GPS, didn't look back. I just drove until I saw towns I knew, until the ridges fell behind me. The listing I'd found online was vague to the point of being suspicious. There were maybe 4 blurry photos total, and none of them showed the full cabin, just corners, a partial roof, a stretch of woods. There was no exact address until after the booking was confirmed. No reviews, not even a real name attached to the host, just the initials JW. And under the description, one line, remote stay for guests who need complete privacy. I laughed when I saw it. That was exactly what I was looking for. Life had been loud for a while. Too loud. Between work stress, friends asking too much, and a family that never knew how to leave well enough alone, I'd gotten to the point where I didn't want to talk to a single person. I didn't want friendly check-ins or inspirational quotes texted at 2 a.m. I wanted silence. I wanted distance. I wanted to vanish for a week without explanation. So the lack of details didn't scare me off, practically reeled me in. Getting there was a whole different story. The GPS gave up about 10 minutes before I arrived. And after that, I had to rely on the host's vague instructions. Stay left at the fork. Turn at the 3rd stump of the white rock on top. Go past the hollow tree. You'll see the cabin eventually, right? The road, or what used to be a road, felt like it hadn't been maintained in decades. It started as gravel, turned toe-packed dirt, then to a messy blend of mud and stone that had my tires slipping and whining like they were begging to go back to civilization. The trees got denser the further in I drove, branches tapping at my windows like they were trying to peek inside. At one point, I stopped and got out to move a fallen limb that was too big to drive over. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, my nerves were already fraying. It was smaller than I expected. A squat little thing built from dark logs, some of which looked almost black, not painted, just aged or burned. The roof was a patchwork of tin sheets nailed over what had probably been a proper shingled roof once. Now it looked like someone had fixed it with whatever scrap metal they had lying around. It had the kind of sagging porch that made you wonder iPhone wrong step would send you straight through the boards. But it was there standing, and it was mine for the week. Inside the cabin was bare but usable. One cot pushed against the wall. A tiny wood stove in the corner with a dented kettle sitting on top. A little table with a single chair. No bathroom. Just a compost toilet in a shed out back, which, let me tell you, is not charming after dark. The only mirror in the place was mounted oddly high on the wall. Standing on my toes, I could barely see my eyebrows in it. Who does that? Still, it told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for luxury. I was here for quiet. For once in my life, I didn't have tonsure to anyone. The first day was uneventful in the best way. I chopped a little firewood, got the stove going, heated up a can of chili, and cracked open a book I hadn't touched in months. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the trees sway. No phone signal, no neighbors, just birds and wind. And that buzzing kind of stillness you forget exists when you live near a city. I went to bed that night thinking maybe I'd own the right thing coming here. And then something weird happened. It wasn't dramatic or terrifying, just off. Lying in the cot, I could see out the back window where the forest sloped upward behind the cabin. When I'd arrived, I remembered spotting a hunting blind up on the ridge. It caught my eye because it was tilted to one side, like it had been there so long it was sinking into the hill. But when I glanced out that window again before bed, it was gone. Just not there anymore. I figured I was remembering wrong. Maybe I'd seen a tree stump or some shadows and thought it was a blind. I told myself I was tired, let it go, pulled the curtain closed, and went to sleep. Next morning, though, it was back. Same place, same awkward lean. Now I was curious. I made coffee, threw on my jacket, and hiked up to check it out. It wasn't a far walk, maybe 5 minutes up the ridge, but the air felt heavier up there, like it hadn't moved in a while. And when I reached the blind, something felt wrong. It looked new. I mean new. The wood was clean, pale, rough around the edges. Nails still. I ran a hand along one of the support beams and got a splinter. That's how fresh it felt. I climbed up inside expecting to find old wrappers, bullet casings, whatever people leave behind in these things. But it was spotless. No trash, no footprints, nowhere, like no one had ever used it. That stuck with me all day. That evening, while the kettle was heating, I looked out the back window again and froze. There was another blind lower on the slope this time. Closer, smaller. And this one, it was facing directly at the cabin. I set the mug down fast and walked away from the window. My hands weren't steady anymore. The third day, I didn't even try to pretend everything was fine. Every time I looked outside, there seemed to be more of them. Not by a lot, but enough to notice if you were paying attention. They were forming a path. Not a straight one, more like a crooked line zigzagging toward the cabin. Always closer, always facing forward. By sunset, the nearest one was maybe 20 feet away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the lights off and just watched. The blinds never moved, but they changed. The new raw wood started to gray. The nails darkened. Moss bloomed across the edges like veins, slow and creeping. They looked like they'd been there for decades, old and weathered and patient. But they never collapsed. They never leaned further. They just waited. Day 4, I barely ate. I stopped checking the time. Every window I looked out of had a blind in view. Some high in the trees, some low, half sunk into the dirt. I stopped counting. What was the point? On the 5th morning, I opened the front door and nearly stepped on a bundle of chopped firewood, tightly packed, tied with twine, set neatly against the wall like a gift. I hadn't touched the axe since day 1. I don't even remember grabbing my stuff, just flashes shoving clothes into bags, knocking over the water jug, grabbing my keys from the nail by the door. My heart wouldn't slow down. My arms felt like they belonged to someone else. The car started on the first try. That alone felt like a miracle. And then the radio turned on by itself. I hadn't touched items. Not since I got there. It crackled with static loud enough to make the speakers rattle. I reached to shut it off, and that's when I heard it. A voice low, clear, like someone was sitting in the passenger seat, leaning in. One word, Ronan. I didn't look at the mirrors. I didn't look out the windows. I just drove. The road felt even narrower on the way out. Trees too close. Branches scraping the sides of the car like fingernails. I don't remember how many turns I took. I just kept going until I saw pavement again. When I hit the first gas station, I didn't slow down. I jerked the wheel into the lot, parked sideways, jumped out. The clerk inside barely looked up as I walked in, handed him my keys and said, "You want a car? Take it." Then I walked, and I kept walking. I never checked the listing again, never tried to get my deposit back. We were out turkey hunting, just me and my cousin Darren deep in the ridge country past Lake Breen. You probably haven't heard of it. Most folks haven't. It's one of those places where the trees all start to look the same after a while and you lose cell signal halfway up the old logging road. That's part of why we go. Peace and quiet. No distractions. Just a couple of days to get out of our heads. That morning we started early. Darren always insists the best time to move is right before sunrise when it's still too cold to think clearly and your boots soak through with dew in the first 10 steps. We had a few spots marked from last season, but about an hour into the hike, he veered off the trail, said he thought he heard something. What we found wasn't a turkey, it was a cabin. low-roofed, half-sunken, nearly hidden behind a curtain of pine and bramble. It looked like it had been swallowed by the woods a long time ago. Honestly, I might have walked right past it if he hadn't stopped and pointed. The wood was gray and weathered, shingles missing like teeth, windows reduced to stray-glass underlayers of grime. Darren grinned like a kid who'd found a secret fort. "Bet there's moonshine stashed in there," he said. I didn't laugh. I felt uneasy right away. There was this pressure in me chest, and I couldn't explain why. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and just know someone's been fighting in there. It was quiet, sure, but not the peaceful kind. More like the pause before something starts. He pushed the door open. It didn't take much. The frame had rotted around the hinges, and the whole thing tilted inward with a tired groan. I followed him inside. The air was still but stale. Not just musty, but thick, like it hadn't moved in years. We stepped onto a floor coated in dust. Not the thin kind you find in attics, but a dense, undisturbed layer that made a soft crunch under our boots. Then I saw the footprints. They were bare, human, too clear to be old. You could see heel marks, arches, even individual toes. They started right inside the door and went straight to the far corner of the main room. And then they just stopped. There was nothing in that corner. No doorway, no furniture, just empty. Sagging boards warped from time and moisture. I stood there too long, staring, trying to reason with it. Even looked up as if maybe someone had gone through a loft or trap door. But there was nothing above us but rafters. Darren shrugged. Probably some drifter slept here once. No big deal. But I knew the dust told a different story. You don't leave prints that sharp unless they're recent. I didn't say it out loud, just nodded and let him move through. We split up, more out of habit than decision. He went down a hallway that led to the back. I stayed in the main room and wandered into what looked like the kitchen. Everything was old, older than either of us, but it wasn't just abandoned. It looked interrupted. The stove was still loaded with unburned wood. Jars sat open on the table, their contents evaporated into crystals. Others were sealed tight, lids rusted and bulging. Shelves were packed with glass containers, some filled with yellow liquid. Inside, I caught glimpses I didn't want to study too long. Something like a tiny hand in one jar, and in another, a pale knot that looked like roots or tendons. I moved into the next room, a bedroom, maybe. At least it had a bed frame. The mattress had been torn open, not cut torn. The fabric split like it had been clawed from the inside. Stuffing scattered across the floor, dragged out like something had been digging. The more I looked, the more frantic it seemed. Then I noticed the wall behind the bed. Scratches. Longwoods carved into the paneling. Not even. Staggered, some shallow, some deep and wide. Not from a knife or tool. From fingers, human fingers. That's when I called out for Darren. "No, sir." I called again, louder. Still nothing. The house wasn't big, but sound didn't carry. It just died. I walked back through the kitchen, careful not to disturb anything. And then I saw the prints again. Only this time there were more. A second trail had appeared. Same size, same shape, but newer. The dust ridged around them like someone had just walked through flour. They started in the same corner as before, but this time they were headed out back toward the door. They hadn't been there earlier. He was sure I had stood in that exact spot. My whole body went still, arms numb, chest tight, breath shallow. I backed up and stepped outside. I started yelling for Darren. The clearing was empty. Trees swayed, but there was no wind. Nothing moved. Then he came crashing through the brush, stumbling, running. He looked pale, lips cracked, eyes glassy. He didn't speak at first, just bent over, hands on his knees, fingers twitching. When he finally looked at me, his voice cracked. Something was calling my name. I waited. He went on. Came from behind me, then the other side, then closer. At one point, it sounded like me, like my own voice. He was trembling. Not dramatic, just constant, like his body couldn't shut it off. I told him about the prints. He didn't ask what they looked like. He didn't look at the cabin. He just nodded once and we started walking. We didn't run. We didn't speak. We just kept moving in silence like we were trying not to wake something. Every branch crack made us flinch. The air grew heavier the farther we got, as if it wanted to hold us there. Took nearly an hour to reach the truck. When we saw it, I almost laughed from relief. Darren climbed in first and turned the key. The engine roared loud and jarring after all that stillness. I got in but didn't close my door right away. I was looking at that tree. I can't explain why, but I expected to see something there. Not ape or sun, not movement, just a shape and outline, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't supposed to see that place. That we hadn't just found it. It had waited. We drove back to town without speaking. At one point, Darren turned the radio on. Only static hissed until he shut it off. When we got back, we didn't unload our gear. We just sat in his living room drinking warm beer or saying little. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the prints, how sharp they were, how fresh, like something had stepped out of that corner while we were both still inside. We never told anyone. Not really. Friends asked if we'd caught anything, and we just said no. We both stopped hunting for a while. Darren moved 2 towns over. Said he needed a change of pace. I didn't press him. As for me, I haven't been back to that ridge. I couldn't even find the spot again if I tried. The forest swallowed it back up. But sometimes when it's real quiet and I'm alone, I still see those prints, clear as day, and I can't stop wondering what else might have been standing in that corner. Music. I was 32 when I agreed to watch over a cabin way out in the Appalachian. It belonged to the uncle of a guy I worked with, a guy named Darren. We weren't close, just the kind of coworkers who nod to each other in the hallway and maybe trade the occasional dumb joke during meetings. His uncle had passed away suddenly, heart attack or something like that, and the family didn't have the time or energy to drive down right away and deal with the property. They wanted someone to just be there, hold the place down until they could sort through the guy's stuff, watch the place basically. I think Darren called it keeping an eye on things, which sounded harmless enough. I guess I said yes because I figured I could use the break. At the time, my apartment felt too small. Work was dragging. The idea of a few quiet days in the woods sounded almost peaceful. No emails, no meetings, no noisy neighbors, just me. Some books, maybe a few drinks in the evening, and no one around to bug me. I was picturing a rustic little cabin, some creaky floorboards, a fire pit out back, something you'd see in an old camping catalog. I didn't ask many questions. That was my first mistake. Getting there was already more of a hassle than I expected. Darren gave me an old set of keys and a drawn map on line paper, which should have been my second clue. I drove out past a town called Hollow Glen, barely more than a gas station and a diner. Then I followed a twisting mountain road that gradually turned from pavement to cracked gravel. The last stretch was steep enough that my car tapped out completely. I had to park at a bend where the road narrowed too much for comfort and finished the last half mile on foot. The trail was mostly uphill, slick with moss in some places and shaded so heavily by trees that it felt like twilight. Even though it was barely past noon, I didn't hear a single bird the whole walk up. Just the crunch of my boots on the damp ground and the occasional rustle of leaves when I brushed against them. The first glimpse of the cabin made me stop. It looked like it had grown there instead of being built, like someone had just convinced the forest to cough up a house. One-story, porch sagging on one side, every window covered, some with nailed shutters, others with thick warped boards. The wood had turned that tired gray color you see on old barns, the kind of dry rot that seems almost soft to the touch. There wasn't a path leading up to it, just uneven stone steps that disappeared into the ground in places. Inside was quiet, heavily quiet if that makes sense. The air was thick with the kind of stillness that makes your ears ringing. It smelled like dust with this faint tang of iron underneath, like someone had left the box of nails open too long. There was a rusted stove tucked into one corner, a cot with a lumpy mattress in the other, and shelves along the back wall crammed full of old jars. Some were cloudy, others looked like they'd once held jam or peaches, or who knows what now turned into strange floating mush. I did a walk through half expecting to find some rodent squatters, but everything was surprisingly untouched. No droppings, no nests, no signs of animals. The doors locked. The windows were sealed shut, really sealed. The shutters had been nailed from the outside, and even where the boards looked like they might be loose, they didn't budge. For a place that had been empty for years, it didn't look ransacked or weather-wrecked. It just looked frozen. The first night, I didn't sleep great. The cot felt like it had rocks stuffed inside it, and every little sound, the pop of the old stove settling, the rustle of a tree branch outside made me jerk awake. I kept telling myself it was just cabin sounds. Old wood creaks, nature doing its thing. But around 3 o'clock in the morning, I found myself holding the flashlight and just staring at the door like I was waiting for something to knock. The next morning, I stepped outside with a cup of instant coffee and stopped short. The dirt around the cabin was covered in footprints. Bare feet, no shoes, no boots, just wide, heavy impressions sunk deep into the soil. Even though it hadn't rained, they circled the entire cabin in a looping path like someone had paced around it all night. The weird part, well, one of the weird parts was how evenly spaced they were. Not hurried, not random, just slow, deliberate steps around and around and around. I followed them a few yards into the trees, heart already thudding. And then they just ended. No scattered dirt, no trail fading into underbrush, just one final step and then nothing, like someone had walked in a straight line and vanished mid-stride. I stood there longer than I probably should have, trying to make sense of it. I told myself they had to be old. Maybe they dried weird, or some animal had left prints that just looked human. But deep down I knew they were fresh. The ground was soft, but not muddy, and the depth of the impressions didn't lie. That night, I locked the doors and dragged the stove closer to the back one just to make myself feel better. I woke up to porch boards creaking. Slow, careful pressure, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Not fast, not random. The same deliberate pace I'd seen in the footprints. I sat up on the cot and held the flashlight tight enough my fingers ached. No knocks, no voices, just creaking, then silence. Eventually, I got up, opened the door just a crack, and aimed the light outside. Nothing. Just the same warped boards in the slope of the hill. But in the beam of the flashlight, I saw it. New prints layered perfectly over the old ones. That was the second night. The third day was when things inside started to change. When I got back from a short walk, not far, I wasn't exactly in the mood to explore. I noticed the zipper on my duffel had been pulled open. Not all the way, just enough to see the edge of a folded shirt sticking out. Except that shirt wasn't folded anymore. It was draped across a chair near the stove like someone had held it up and laid it down gently. The chair itself had moved too. It had been tucked under the table and now it was angled, turned to face the cot where I slept. I stared at it for a solid minute, willing myself to believe I had done it and just forgotten. But I hadn't. I know I hadn't. Then I saw the jar. One of the old cloudy jars from the shelf was sitting directly in the middle of the floor, centered like someone had placid it with care. I picked it up, hands trembling, fingers sweaty, and put it back on the shelf. I straightened the chair, refolded the shirt, closed the duffel. But that feeling didn't go away. That feeling like something was still in the room with me, just out of view, watching how I fixed its arrangement. That night, I sat up on the cot with the flashlight on and didn't even pretend I was going to sleep. I stayed that way for hours, At some point, my eyelids got too heavy. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of glass scraping across the floor. One of the jars was rolling, tipped on its side, spinning lazily like someone had just flicked it with their finger. I froze, watching it clink softly across the floorboards. Then I shifted the light and saw the chair again. It had moved closer this time, just a few inches, but enough tinnitus. Still facing the cot, still facing me. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. No one had come in, nothing had opened, and yet here it was. This slow rearrangement, like the cabin itself was being set, as if I was the only thing out of place. That pressure in the room was unbearable. Not like air or heat, more like a tension, like the walls were focusing on me. I could feel it in my throat. Heavy, quiet, intent. I left. I shoved everything into the duffel without checking what I'd packed. I didn't put the jar back. I didn't straighten the chair. I left the door swinging open and didn't even glance at the porch. I walked straight into the woods, flashlight in one hand, bag over my shoulder, boots slipping on damp roots. I didn't stop when the underbrush snapped beside me. I didn't turn when something, not wind, moved just outside the beam of light. I didn't breathe until I saw the shine of my car through the trees and finally got the key into the ignition on the third try. I drove. I didn't look back. I kept going until I saw other cars again, until gas stations looked normal and the sky didn't feel like it was pressing down on me. I was 33 when I booked that cabin in Marchwood. It was a quick, impulsive decision after a rough couple of weeks. Work had gotten overwhelming. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, and I hadn't had more than 5 minutes to myself in what felt like months. I needed quiet. No meetings, no emails, no conversations. Just time to sit, breathe, and let my brain slow down. The listing looked perfect. A tiny wooden cabin on a ridge supposedly built in the 50s but charmingly updated. There was a photo of a port swing facing a valley and one off those wide open shots of the sky that makes you want to pack a bag immediately. Promised complete privacy. No neighbors in sight, no Wi-Fi, no TV. At the bottom, it said disconnect to reconnect. Sounded like exactly what I needed, but the moment I pulled up, something felt off. The cabin looked like it had been dropped there and forgotten. It wasn't centered on the ridge. It leaned to one side like a support beam had given up years ago. Smaller than the photos, darker, too. The wood had a dull gray tone, like it had soaked up decades of rain. One chine on the porch swing was twisted, creaking slightly as it swayed. I sat there in the car, keys in hand, wondering if I should have read the reviews more closely. Still, I was already there. I'd driven nearly 4 hours and turning back would have felt like defeat. I told myself the photos were just outdated or touched up. The inside would be better. It wasn't. The moment I stepped through the door, it felt like a slanted funhouse. The floor tilted inward toward the center of the room like the whole place was slowly sinking. Gravity cemento nudged you toward the dip as you walked. The furniture didn't match the listing. No sleek leather couch, just a sagging plaid one that smelled faintly damp. Not mold exactly, more like fabric that never quite dried. The coffee table was scratched up like someone had dragged tools across it. One chair sat crooked, its legs wobbling when I leaned on it. Everything felt off-kilter. Crooked pictures, a slanted shelf, windows that didn't quite shut. But I reminded myself I hadn't come for aesthetics. I wanted quiet, nothing else. I dropped my bag in the bedroom, opened the windows, and tried to settle in. That first evening, I cooked something simple, canned soup and toast. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the stillness. No emails, no pings, just the creak of old wood and the sound of a spoon against the pot. I carried my plate to the table, and that's when I saw it. The hallway. It ran straight from the main room toward the back. Earlier, I'd walked at 2 doors. Bathroom on the left, bedroom on the right. Short, narrow, normal. But now there were 3. I stopped, istered, bathroom, bedroom, and at the end, one more. Flat against the wall, painted the same pale yellow. No knob, no handle, just a blank rectangle where nothing had been before. I retraced my steps, walking back to the front door and down the hallway again. Felt longer. The lighting, maybe the angle, but something about it was wrong. I set my plate down and walked closer. Bathroom left, bedroom right, and the third door dead center. No frame, no trim, just a cold, solid surface. I pressed my hand against it. The wood was chilled, unmoving. I heard nothing on the other side. No breeze, no thud, just silence. And I knew that door hadn't been there when I arrived. I stood there searching for an explanation. Settling wood, shadows, exhaustion. Maybe I'd simply missed it. Eventually, I shook it off, picked up my plate, and sat down to eat. But I didn't sleep well that night. I left the bedroom door cracked, angled just enough to see the hallway. Around midnight, the floor creaked. Not random creaks, not settling. Footsteps evenly spaced, slow, heavy, like someone barefoot walking down the hall. One board, then another, then another. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I just lay there staring through the gap. And there it was, the third door, sharper now. Edges more defined, like it had stepped forward out of the wall. And in my gut, I felt it wanted me to notice, like it was waiting for acknowledgement. I stared until daylight seeped through the window, and just like that, it was gone. The hallway was short again. 2 doors, everything normal. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I was relieved. Stress, fatigue, maybe even sleep paralysis. None of it was real. The next day, I stayed out. Trails, mud on my shoes, granola on a rock. I avoided the cabin as long as possible. When I came back, everything looked fine. I made tea, read a book, almost believed it was behind me. But that night, everything changed. I stepped out of the bathroom, drying my hands, and froze. The hallway was deeper, much deeper. The floor felt wrong, like someone had swapped out the boards. The wood grain ran in the opposite direction. Each step echoed hollow, like I was walking across a box. And the third door wasn't just there. It was open. No knob, no frame, just a black gap at the end of the hall. My first thought was it must lead outside, but no breeze came through. No night air, no sound of crickets, only silence. And then I heard it, a dragging sound. Something brushing against the floor inside the dark. Slow, steady, like fabric pulled across wood. I froze. Every part of me screamed not to move. That if I stepped closer, I would see something I could never unsee. Something that didn't belong in this world. My vision pulsed with my heartbeat. And then I ran. No thinking, no packing. I grabbed my keys, yanked the front door open, and bolted. The swing groaned as it passed, but I didn't look back. I dove into the driver's seat, started the car with shaking hands, and tore down the gravel road, headlights bouncing, dust flying. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. My uncle used to say his grandfather built it with his own hands. Way back when there were still logging roads cutting through the Appalachian Mountains, people lived up in those hills like they were part of the woods themselves. Back then, whole families raised goats and kids in collapsing sheds. They cooked over fires and didn't think much of town life. No plumbing, no phones, just trees, mud, and whatever you could grow or hunt. He made it sound almost romantic, like something out of an old movie. But by the time I saw it, the cabin looked like the forest had been trying to swallow it for decades. The roof slouched in the middle. The wood had turned dark and soft, and the trees pressed so close that their roots had begun pushing against the foundation stones. That summer, I had just turned 16. Joel, my cousin, had just graduated high school. My uncle thought it would be a good bonding trip to send us up there together with a few tools, a couple of bags of food, and a stack of vague instructions. Fix it up a little, he told us. Sweep it out. Patch the roof if you can. Get it back in shape. I didn't think either of us believed we were going to get much done, but it sounded like an adventure. We were teenagers. We didn't really think things through. The first glimpse of the place came at the end of a narrow footpath that curved up into the trees for what felt like forever. No cell service, no signs, just trees and more trees until suddenly there it was leaning to the right. One shutter hanging by a rusted hinge and the front door looking like it had been kicked in and badly reattached. It creaked when the wind touched it. A low, miserable sound, like it was groaning from the joints. We spent most off that first day hauling our gear inside and sweeping out what had clearly been a small animal's den. There were droppings in the corners and what might have been a bird's nest tucked up between two beams. We shook out the bedding, dusted off the table, and tried not to think about tetanus. There was no electricity, just a busted lantern and a half-empty bottle of lamp oil my uncle had packed. We figured it would last a few nights if we were careful. That evening, we set our CS up against the back wall away from the drafty windows and whatever might wander past. When we tried to close the front door, we realized it didn't fit the frame anymore. The top corner stuck out no matter how hard we shoved. Joel joked that it was mountain ventilation. I gave him a laugh, but honestly, it made me uneasy. That gap was just wide enough to see slivers of movement if anything or anyone was outside. The first weird thing happened that night, though it was subtle. Joel left his boots beside the hearth before bed. When we woke up, they were placed neatly at the foot of his cot. Laces tied, toes perfectly aligned, and he blinked at them, then looked at me. "Did you move my boots?" he asked, half laughing. I hadn't touched them. Hinted like he believed me, but I could tell he was unsettled. We both were. Still, we let it go. Maybe he moved, the man forgot. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe we just wanted to believe that. The second night, I left my pocket knife on the table next to the lantern. When I went to grab it the next morning, it was gone. I checked the table, the floor, even dug through my backpack. Joel rolled his eyes and told me to calm down, but he went quiet when he saw it. The knife was stuck in the door frame, buried in the wood at shoulder height, perfectly straight, like someone had thrown it. He stared, then looked at me. "Are you messing with me?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew I hadn't done it. By the third night, we weren't making jokes anymore. We just played cards quietly, lantern between us, trying not to look at the windows. The fire and the hearth had gone out, but neither of us wanted to get up. That's when we heard it. Movement above us. At first, it was faint, like shifting weight or creaking wood, but then it grew louder, deliberate, slow, heavy steps crossing from one side of the roof to the other, back and forth, steady, measured. We froze. There's no attic, no loft, nothing up there but the roof and the open sky. Joel grabbed the lantern and we stepped outside, hearts pounding. The roof was empty. No branches, no animals, nothing but sagging shingles. We walked the perimeter, shining light up at every angle. Still nothing, but the sound continued, soft, just out of sync with our movements, like it didn't want to be seen. Back inside, the air felt heavy, clinging to our skin. Every time we tried to sit still, something would knock. Sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes on one wall, then answered by a tap from the opposite side. Joel dropped the deck of cards. His hands were shaking too much to hold them. He didn't try to pick them up. The fourth night is the one that broke us. We'd given up, pretending everything was fine. We whispered about leaving, trying not to sound too scared, when suddenly the front door slammed shut on its own hard. The sound echoed. The frame shook, westered at it. Then came the footsteps. Outside, circling the cabin, slow, dragging footsteps, shuffling through the dirt and leaves. Once, twice, again, round and round. We killed the lantern without speaking and sat there in the dark, barely breathing. The footsteps picked up, then slowed, then silence. Right outside the door, we waited, I don't know how long, minutes, hours. Then the doorknob twitched, just once. Not a turn, not a jiggle, just a sharp twitch like someone flicking it to see if it would move. That was it. We didn't sleep. We sat until the sun pushed through the cracks in the walls. When morning came, we packed fast, threw everything into our bags and tried to pen the door. It wouldn't budge. We shoved with our shoulders, kicked it until the hinges shrieked, and it cracked open. Outside in the soft dirt was a perfect ring of footprints. Bare, deep, flat and wide. Toes spread like something that had never worn shoes. They circled the cabin again and again, overlapping before veering into the trees. We didn't speak. We didn't stop to eat. We left everything, our bedding, our food, the tools. We hiked straight down the hill, never looking back until we reached the old truck. Jamie and Nolan had been planning a weekend away for a while, so when they asked if I wanted in, I said yes. No hesitation, we left on a Friday morning, crammed everything into Nolan's old Subaru, and drove for what felt like forever. Music blasted at first, windows down, snacks flying around the car. Butaz, the roads got smaller, the mood shifted. Paved highways turned into narrow gravel trails, and the forest started closing in. The air got cooler, greener, thicker somehow. At one point, Jamie said, "I swear if we see a bear, I'm throwing you both to the ground and running." It was probably a joke, but I didn't laugh. Eventually, the GPS gave up and we had to follow handwritten directions Jamie's cousin had scribbled down, stuff like, "Turn right at the third unmarked fork and drive past the old fence. Then take the dirt path on the left." Not exactly comforting, but somehow we made it. The cabin sat in a clearing just big enough for the car to pull into. Trees towered all around it. It was smaller than I expected, not some picturesque log getaway. One story, weathered siding that hadn't seen paint in decades. The porch tilted slightly, and the stone chimney looked like it might topple if you sneezed. Jamie stepped out of the car, looked around, and said, "Tell me this isn't straight out of a murder documentary." Kind off was. Still, we were there and there was no signal, so we figured we'd make Thebiest of it. Inside was just as worn. A single main room with a dusty fireplace and an old couch that looked like it had survived a house fire. The kitchen branched off to the left, barely big enough for two people. Behind the fireplace, a hallway led to two bedrooms, each with just a bed and a chair. The air smelled faintly of burned wood and something older, maybe mildew, maybe dust. Jamie and Nolan claimed the bedrooms. I didn't mind taking the cot near the fireplace. Felt kind of cozy. They gave me a couple of scratchy wool blankets and I set up next to the hearth. We unpacked our food cans, bread, fruit, snacks, no fridge, just an old cooler with ice Nolan had brought out. We started a fire, made soup, played cards late into the night. It was simple, but it felt good to be off-grid. Around midnight, they both peeled off to bed, still joking, still laughing. I stayed up a bit longer, poking at the fire and soaking in the warmth. But when I finally laid back on the cot, something felt wrong. Not scary, just off. First, it was hard to pin down. The furniture looked the same, but the spacing felt different, like the armchair by the window had shifted half a foot to the left. I stared, trying to remember if it had always been that far from the wall. Then the shadows caught my eye. They fell strangely. The flicker from the fire didn't line up with where the shadow should have been. One of them looked warped, stretched, like someone had pulled it the wrong way. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, blinked. Still wrong. I told myself I was tired. Probably the long drive, the weird lighting, maybe dehydration. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The room was floating like it wasn't anchored to anything. When I woke the next morning, everything looked fine. Nothing was out of place. The shadows were gone. The chair was where it should have been. Or maybe it had never moved. I didn't say anything. We made breakfast. Instant coffee, granola bars, bruised bananas. We hiked that day following a trail around a ridge. The forest was dense. Beautiful, yes, but quiet in a way that made you whisper. At one point, we stopped to listen. There was nothing. No birds, no wind, just us and our breathing. Back at the cabin, muddy and tired, we made more soup, ate by the fire, started a game of cards whenever finished. That night, I noticed something else. As I sat by the fire, I looked toward the kitchen. The doorway looked wrong. Narrower, maybe. Not dramatic, just enough to make me squint and think, huh, like someone had shaved an inch off the frame. I stared a long time, waiting for it to shift back. Eventually, it did. Or maybe it hadn't changed at all. I laughed it off and went to bed. But sometime after midnight, a sound woke me. Something dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate, not fast enough to be an animal. Too steady to be wind. A long scrape, then a pause, then another. I didn't move, just opened my eyes and stared into the dark. The sound stopped. I turned toward the kitchen. The doorway was silent. Nothing moved. The fire was almost out, just glowing coals. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but it wasn't restful. In the morning, one of the kitchen chairs was out of place. Moved a few feet from the table, turned to face the cot. My cot. Jamie laughed when I pointed it out. You sleepwalk now? She asked. I didn't. Nolan swore he hadn't touched it either. We shrugged it off, but I noticed they both looked at the chair again later. Quiet this time. We hiked again, but the forest felt different. Every trail looked familiar and wrong at the same time. Trees leaned in ways I didn't remember. The silence felt heavier, like it was listening. That last night, everything cracked open. I was dead asleep when I woke to footsteps, not inside, on the porch. Each step was heavy, deliberate. The boards creaked in rhythm, one at a time, from the edge of the deck to the door. I froze, my eyes locked on the door just a few feet from me. There was no lock, just an iron latch that barely held it closed. The footsteps stopped outside. Then the latch rattled once, then again. Not hard, just testing it. I whispered Jamie's name. Nothing. Whispered louder. Still nothing. The hallway was silent. I sat up. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook the walls. I grabbed the flashlight, switched it on, and yanked the door open. Nothing, just the porch and trees and darkness. But there on the bottom step, pressed into the damp wood, were footprints, bare, large, human. They led down the steps and disappeared into the trees. I slammed the door, locked the latch, though it wouldn't do much. Then I ran to wake Jamie and Nolan. I didn't have to convince them. The look on my face did all the work. We packed in silence, threw everything into bags, left the soup pot in the sink, didn't fold anything. Nolan knocked over a chair and didn't bother picking it up. We walked fast down the trail to the car, flashlights bouncing, eyes flicking toward every tree. When I looked back one last time, the cabin stood crooked beneath the trees, half-swallowed Bishadow, porch empty. We didn't talk much on the drive home. A guy I work with, Micah, said his cousin owned a cabin way out in the Appalachian Hills. He couldn't remember exactly where, just that it was out there somewhere, tucked in deep. Apparently, the cousin hadn't used it in years, but it was still stocked and solid. A little dusty, but totally safe were his exact words. The key would be under a flat stone by the porch steps. That was the extent of the directions.no photos. No warning, no real address. We figured, why not? It was early spring. We all needed a break. A free cabin in the woods sounded like a good idea at the time. Something you'd look back on fondly, or at least with a laugh. So it was me, my fiancée Harper, my buddy Nate, and our 3 dogs. Mine, her border collie, and Nate's ancient mutt who somehow still had the energy of a toddler on sugar. We left late morning and spent most of the drive winding up into the hills. The roads got narrower the deeper we went, twisting in sharp, slow turns that made the GPS glitch out completely. It stopped updating altogether about 45 minutes before we arrived, which made finding the place a guessing game. The last stretch was more trail than road, just ruts and mud, trees pressing in like they didn't want us there. They scraped at the truck like fingernails the whole way in. When the trees finally broke, the cabin sat in a clearing like it had been dropped there by accident. Old wood, dark with age and rain, hunkered low against the slope like it was bracing for something. Not quite rotting, but definitely on the downhill slide of livable. The way it leaned slightly into the ridge made it look stubborn, like it had decided long ago it wasn't going anywhere, no matter what time or nature threw at it. Inside, it was surprisingly clean, but only in the way a place can be clean and still completely wrong. The proportions were off. There were only 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a hallway that bent sharply to the right, almost like it had been jammed into the structure afterward. The floors weren't level. Every door hung at an angle like the frames had settled differently. None of them closed properly. Somebody had tried to update the place with electricity. Wires were stapled along the ceiling beams and mismatched outlet covers clung to the walls. But it looked halfway done, like whoever started the job got bored or creeped out and never came back. Webb brought the dogs in first. That's when things started feeling wrong. Not big dramatic wrong, but subtle skin prickle wrong. From the moment they crossed the threshold, none of the dogs would go near the hallway. They stuck to the main room, skirting the walls like something invisible was in the middle of the floor. When I brought in their food bowls, they bolted for the kitchen. They ate fast. No begging, no hesitation, and then ran straight back out. No lounging, no sniffing around, none of the usual dog stuff. Just business like they were clocking in and clocking out. My dog Ralph, a food-obsessed lab mix who normally stares at you until you give him a bite, barely looked at me once his food was down. It was like he was trying not to draw attention to himself. That night, everything got worse. Around midnight, a smell started creeping into the cabin. At first, it was faint, sour, like compost or a trash bin left in the sun. Then it thickened, burning plastic mixed with something damp and rotten. It was the kind of smell that makes your body react before your brain does. I couldn't breathe through my nose without gagging. I stepped outside thinking something had caught fire. Maybe old wiring sparked. Maybe a critter chewed through something. But as soon as I got past the porch steps, the air was completely clear. Cool. Fresh. No smell. Back inside, it hit me again. Thick and wet. Worse now, like it had soaked into the walls. That same night, the light started acting up. Not flickering, not dimming, just shutting off, then clicking back on minutes later with no warning. The kitchen lamp died while Harper was brushing her teeth. 5 minutes later, it buzzed back on untouched. We checked the breakers. Everything was fine. The hallway light didn't even have a switch. It would just go dark, then flare back to life like nothing happened. It felt like the place had nerves, like it was twitching. The next day, Harper said she had to leave early for a shift that got moved up. She packed fast, didn't say much. I offered to go with her, but she told me and Nate to stay, finish packing. She didn't want to drag the dogs back up here later. So by evening, it was just me and Nate. Around midnight, we sat in the front room, exhausted, not even talking. The front door was across from us, 2 tall windows on either side. That's when I saw movement, a shadow quick across one of the panes. I froze, waited. A few seconds passed. Then Nate said, "Did you see that?" He described exactly what I saw. He thought it looked like someone walking past with a flashlight, but there was no road, no path, no people, just woods. I told him it was probably a reflection, maybe a plane overhead, but we both knew better. Later, while grabbing boxes from the back hallway, Nate stopped cold. He stared into the bedroom and whispered, "There's someone in the doorway," his face drained of color. He said it was an old woman just standing there watching. I turned to look. Nothing. I stepped inside, checked, still nothing. But Nate wouldn't go near that part of the house again. We stepped outside to shake it off. Nate lit a cigarette and pointed at a stump near the clearing. It was oozing sap, thick amber streaming like it was freshly cut. But the top was dark. Age.it hadn't been touched in years, and yet it was bleeding. Back inside, we checked the last bedroom. Just a dresser, a box of old books, and one toy shoved into the corner. A Furby, one of those blinking things from the 9s, crusted with dust, formatted gray, deadly looking. I bent down, mostly out of curiosity, just to move it. Its eyes popped open. It blinked, chattered in a scrambled robotic voice, high-pitched and garbled. I grabbed it and hurled it through the window. Glass shattered. It vanished into the yard, still chattering as it disappeared into the dark. That changed everything. The cabin felt angry, heavy. The air thickened. The walls seemed closer, not just around us, but aware of us. We rushed then. No brakes, just grabbing and tossing things into the truck. Around 3, I was stacking boxes in the bed while Nate handed Theme up. That's when I saw it through the trees. Massive, taller than any person, broad shoulders hunched, limbs too long, too black to make out detail. It didn't move, just stood there. And its eyes, 2 burning red spots, not glowing, not flickering, steady, fixed on me. I jumped out of the truck and yelled that we had to go. Nate didn't move at first. Then he saw it too. We ran. Didn't close the doors. Didn't shut the tailgate. We just drove.
Tire spoon.
Mud sprayed. Boxes shifted in the back. We didn't speak for hours. When we finally did, we described the same thing. The same impossible size. The same fire-called eyes. The next morning, Harper said she forgot her patio set and wanted to go back. I tried to say no. She looked at me like I was unreasonable, so I caved. The moment we pulled into the clearing, I knew the cabin looked the same, but the air was wrong. The ground where the garden had been was shifting. Footprints pressed into the soil one after another, like something heavy was walking, but nothing was there. I told her to get in the truck right now. No argument. We'd buy a new set. I didn't care if it was solid gold. We weren't staying. As we drove, she looked in the mirror. Her face went pale. Then she whispered, still following us. I look back, more footprints still forming, step by step, following until the trees swallowed the clearing. I haven't been back since. Caleb, some guy he'd met through a night class at the community center who owned a stretch of land way out in the Blue Ridge foothills. And I mean really out there, past paved roads, past street signs, deep into the trees where your phone switches from no signal to just giving up entirely. The kind of place where your ears start ringing from the silence, and even your car seems nervous about the last few miles. There was an old cabin on the property that Caleb's grandfather had built by hand back in the 60s. According to him, it had stood untouched for years. No power, no plumbing, no insulation. Theo pitched it to us like it was this rustic getaway. Unplug for a few days, hike, cook over a fire, drink too much, maybe swim if the creek wasn't frozen solid. He called it a digital detox, which was hilarious coming from a guy who once brought a ring light on a camping trip. It ended up being the 4 of us, me, Theo, my girlfriend Mara, and Rory, Theo's cousin, who I barely knew at the time, that we loaded up Theo's SUV with gear, sleeping bags, coolers, camping stoves, too many granola bars, and a suspicious amount of boxed wine. The plan was 4 nights out there, Thursday through Monday, just to exist. I wasn't thrilled. I've never been a nature guy. I like knowing where I am on a map. I like light switches and running water. But Mara had been wiped out for midterms and Theo already had the key, so I didn't push back. It felt easier to go along and start a fight about freezing to death in a glorified shed. The day before we left, we met Caleb to grab the key. He didn't say much. He had this quiet, twitchy energy, like he was always listening for something just out of range. He handed Theo a heavy old key ring with a single rusted iron key. It looked like it belonged in a dungeon, not a cabin. And right as we were getting into the car, Caleb said one thing. Don't go past the fork in the trail after dark. The trees bend different up there. That was it. No context, no explanation, just that. We laughed about it for hours in the car. Called it hillbilly horror movie bait. Theo even read it back in this dramatic campfire ghost story voice. We had no idea. We reached the cabin just before sunset. The road ended a mile out, so we had to park and hike the rest. That last stretch was thick pine and uneven ground. You couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. The silence was heavy. When we broke through the trees and saw the place, my stomach dropped. It wasn't scary. Not exactly. It just didn't look right. Like someone built a cabin from memory and got most of it close, but not the details. The windows were too small, set too high, like they weren't meant to be looked out of. The porch sagged to one side, though the wood looked freshly replaced. The door was narrow and too tall, like it belonged on a church. It was subtle, but it made you stare a second longer than you wanted to. Inside, it was cold and bare. 4 rooms, a big central space with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a dry sink and a busted hand pump, 2 tiny bedrooms with wire cuts and a square trapdoor in one corner leading to a rude cellar. No photos, no dust, no signs anyone had been there in years, except it was too clean, like someone had scrubbed the place top to bottom then just left. There were scratches along the baseboards, clusters of them, too shallow to be claws, too scattered for furniture, all about the same size, 3 or 4 in long, wide at the base, tapering to a point, grouped low to the ground like something small had scraped at the walls. Repeatedly, deliberately, we didn't talk about the scratches. We just pretended we hadn't seen them. That first night, we sat around the fire pit outside, boxed wine and camping mugs, marshmallows over the flames. It felt like summer camp. Around midnight, Rory went into the woods to pee. He was gone 10 minutes. When he came back, he was off, quiet, face pale, shirt inside out, though none of us noticed at first. When I asked if he'd gotten lost, he just stared into the fire and muttered, "The wind's not right in there," which made no sense because the air had been still all night. He didn't say anything else. We went inside around 1/2 drunk and tired. Mara's sleeping bag, the one she'd laid out earlier, was zipped and folded neatly on the cot like someone had packed it for her. She accused Theo. He swore he hadn't touched it. So did Rory. So did I. Then I realized my hoodie was missing. I tore through the cabin looking for it. Sure, I dropped it outside. And then Rory pointed at the door. My hoodie was hanging on a wooden hook by the frame. There hadn't been a hook there earlier. I know there hadn't. It was carved with little notches along the edges like tally marks. We stood there for a long time not speaking. That was night 1. Night 2 was worse. Around 10, Theo decided he wanted to check out the trail Caleb had warned us about. He was 3 drinks deep, riding that dumb, stubborn confidence that shows up when someone's buzzed and trying to prove a point. Rory went with him. The trail fort passed a broken down fence we'd seen on the hike in. The left side curved toward the stream. The right led in the tighter trees and darker brush. No signs, no tracks. Mara begged me not to follow them, so I stayed. I still don't know if that was the right choice. We waited. First half hour, we made small talk. Second hour, silence. The woods grew too quiet, not peaceful, hollow, like sound had been pulled out of the air. Even the fire seemed muted. And then the front door knob turned. No footsteps, no warning, just a slow twist. The door creaked open 2 inches. Nobody was there. 30 seconds later, Rory walked in. His face was blank, eyes unfocused, jeans soaked from the knees down, shirt torn at the sleeve. He walked like he'd forgotten how to use his legs. I asked where Theo was. Heb blinked at me, confused, like I'd asked in another language. Then he said, "He's still talking to her." We didn't know what to do. Tried to press him, but he shut down. Wouldn't look at us. Wouldn't answer. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. I didn't want to go. Every part of me screamed not to, but staying felt worse. The trees looked different at night. Trunks curved toward the trail. Tops leaned in like they were listening, like they were waiting. At the fork, the left trail looked normal. The right was turned up like something had crawled along it. Long dragging furrows, no boots, no animal tracks, just strange footprints, small, wrong toes spaced unevenly, arched like claws that I called out for Theo. Nothing. Then something called back. Help him. Not his voice. I ran back at the cabin. The fireplace was lit. Nobody had touched it. Rory sat in front of it, whispering. Mara curled up on a cot, tears streaming silently. Rory looked at me and smiled like it was a private joke. She didn't want him at first. She wanted me, then stopped talking. That night, none of us slept. Every creak in the wood, every flicker at the window, we were waiting. Around 5, Rory got up barefoot, walked outside, faced the woods. His lips moved. No sound. I followed. He turned to me, dead-eyed. She's still there, but she's not watching me now. Then he shoved something into my hand. A folded piece of paper. A drawing, rough and smudged, done in charcoal. The cabin, all the windows black except one, the front one. A face inside watching. We left that morning. Theo never came back. Rory hasn't spoken since. His family put him in a clinic near Rockbridge.